From Chaos to Cosmos, Creation Myths and the Quest for a Centered Self, a seminar by Robert Moore, presented by the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago on July 22, 1991.
Let me just suggest to you a format for what we do today, how I'd like us to proceed. I'd like to spend the morning portion, at least a great deal of it, looking at mythology, psychology and mythology, different ways of thinking about psychology and mythology, a Jungian way of thinking about that. I'd like us to do some phenomenology of creation mythology. And I'd like to draw on each of you, so be thinking about creation myths you know about, because I'm going to ask you to mention them when we start doing our phenomenology. And also, your assignment is to be thinking about themes, major motifs in creation mythology that you know about. Doesn't matter if you just know about one. Think about the one you know about, and we're going to put up themes so that we can be serious about our phenomenological reflection. Jungian, who is true to Jung's heritage, will always do phenomenology first. In fact, you'll do phenomenology before you do history, which Jungians get criticized for some good reasons. But in other words, so we want to put our phenomenologist hats on after we talk about some of the issues involved in this kind of study and why we do it. I mean, why bother? Then I would like to spend a little time this morning talking about someone that I think is very important. In fact, I'll talk about two people that I think are very important. I'll talk about Joseph Campbell briefly, but I will talk more about Mircea Eliade, who I think is a person who, because of his introversion and tendency to be a recluse, really has not received the appreciation anywhere, really, that he deserves, and especially in Jungian circles. It's one thing to name his name, and another thing to look at the enormous significance of his work for what we're doing today. So I'm going to spend some time talking about Eliade's way of thinking about this in relationship to humans, in relationship to the human soul, the human psyche. And then, depending on how far we can get with that, if we get through with that before lunch, I'll be happy. If we get through with it and leaving some time to get into our beginning of psychological reflection on this stuff, that'll be fine. But we'll just see how far we get. And this afternoon, I would like to talk about this mythology in the light of psychological and particularly psychoanalytic reflections. Now, I want you to be thinking about how classical Freudian thought might illuminate some of this stuff that we'll be hearing as themes, and how other systems of thought, self-psychology particularly, would illuminate this, and how Jung's thought would illuminate it. We're going to look at some different perspectives on it. And then we're going to be focusing in on the issue of the self, the self, the structure of the self, the forming of a self. Why do people talk about this self business so much? Doesn't everybody have a self? And if so, how do you mean that? And is there such a thing as developing the self? And we need to talk about it because we might even speak of creating the self, building the self. And we have to, this afternoon, we'll have to be clear about, well, are we talking about the big S self or the little s self here? And so we're going to be thinking about more, some of you were here the other day when I was lecturing. We have to think about relationships between blueprints for the self and the project you are involved in as you seek to emerge as a self. All kinds of assumptions that I've got, you see, that I've built into those comments. Now, I had the opportunity yesterday to speak to the Oasis conference on Joseph Campbell about the significance of mythology for the world and the continuing significance of the study of myth. And I'll touch on a couple of points that I made yesterday because it's important for us. Then I'll relate it much more to psychological issues. So let's start off with that. It should be clear to us that at the outset that it is not agreed upon today either what myth is, really, how it formed, what it's for, what it isn't for, how important is it today, if at all, what is the best thing for human beings to do with myth? Is it better for them to get rid of it? Is it better for them to find their myth and live their myth? Is it better for them to use myth as a laboratory to study the human self? If we do a real good psychology based on mythology, then can we throw out mythology after we have studied it and figured it all out? Say we accomplished that? Or is mythology something that is so essential to human being that when you get the idea that you're doing away with it, you're being possessed by the mythological imagination and you get inflated and insane in various ways, which the peoples of the ancient world all understood, but modern people do not understand. See? Think about all these things. We'll be talking about this today, with particular slant on creation mythology, but it really matters what you think about these things. In other words, it's not just a ho-hum issue here, because it really has to do with your view of human being, your understanding of the essential nature and dynamics of human being. And wherever you stand, where you stand really has enormous implications for how you view psychology, how you view psychotherapy, how you view politics, how you view our planetary problems, and all these things. And so let me just articulate something about the tradition that I believe Jungians are in. And if they're not aware of being in it, they need to be aware that they're in it. So let me just say that I believe that the tradition that Carl Jung represented on this stuff is a tradition that began with the German anthropologist Adolf Bastian, who worked a great deal in the 19th century to argue the psychological unity of the human species. He was an anthropologist in Berlin. The chair in anthropology at the University of Berlin was named after him in the formative years of anthropology in Germany. It doesn't, to Jungians, it doesn't sound like a big deal, but to assume that there is a psychological and spiritual unity underlying folklore, underlying what he called folk ideas, elementary ideas of the people, is a controversial idea. Always has been controversial. It is extremely controversial today, and in the major universities, they think that anybody that believes that there is some sort of psychological and spiritual unity that issues out of the human psyche and issues forth in myth and religion and so forth, folklore, there's a tendency to assume that those people are really crazy, idiots, or stupid, at least. Unless they happen to be Claude Lévi-Strauss. And if you there are some people that can believe things that sound very Jungian and get away with it. So in other words, if you're a French structuralist, it's less controversial than if you're an American Jungian that believes in the collective unconscious. But for the most part, even Lévi-Strauss made people nervous. And so he's not all that influential in the interpretation of myth today. Two major figures in the study of myth, Campbell, Joseph Campbell, and Mircea Eliade, stand in Bastian's tradition in a strong way. It's no accident, I think, the affiliation of Jung with, in people's minds, with Campbell and Eliade, because they have a common heritage, and the heritage has this assumption: mythology issues out of the human spirit, the human soul, the human experience. There is some sense in which it is a natural expression of the human. You get someone like Ernst Cassirer, the great philosopher, who wrote a 3-volume philosophy of symbolic forms, which he talked about the mythic imagination, which he assumed to be grounded in the human soul, the human psychological functioning. These are similar assumptions. So a contemporary Jungian who looks to Campbell or looks to Eliade and finds a common some common attitudes there, is simply recognizing a kindred spirit in this tradition. Now let me talk a little bit more about the issues involved here. If mythology is an expression of this species, let me just put it more in a statement. It's my assumption, and I believe that it's consistent with Jung's thought, that human beings could be called the animal which mythologizes. Period. In other words, from my point of view, and I think it is a Jungian point of view, a classical Jungian point of view, mythology is animal behavior of this particular animal. So, in other words, I think if you look at mythology in a way that's consistent with this tradition of thought, it will help you be clear about why we do what we do today. If you simply say, human beings are a certain very special kind of ape, and one of the things that makes this ape special is it mythologizes. Wherever it is, you can just put it anywhere. You can put it in Sumatra, you can put it over here in in South America. You can put it over there in India, and wherever you put this ape, called Homo sapiens, put it down, it will mythologize. That's right. That's demonstrated. There's nobody that's going to seriously argue that is informed. Argue against that is informed. So someone like me then will simply take this theme in Jung's tradition and this wider tradition and say, okay, so mythology is behavior. It's expressive behavior of this animal. And so as a human scientist, I'm not going to look at mythology with any less interest than I will look at any other expression of human behavior. I'm going to look at dreams. I'm going to look at aggressive behaviors. I'm going to look at affiliative behaviors. I'm going to look at all these. And I'm going to look at mythologizing behaviors. Because I'm going to assume that they're issuing forth from this species, from this particular species, this particular form of primate. And I'm going to look at that, and I'm going to try to figure out why is it that this animal does this, and what does this mean? In the same way that I would look at, the swallows flying back to Capistrano, I'd want to know why do they do that. Now I'm studying birds, and by golly, they fly back to Capistrano. So let's get serious about trying to figure out how this is an expression of this species of bird. Yes, Mike.
Ascribing meaning to what ordinarily would be chaotic events?
Well, it is. Well, see, this is the issue. Now, see, I'm saying to you, be clear today. When you go out and you run into some university professor who teaches courses in mythology, and has got a PhD from Harvard or someplace, and therefore is supposed to know all about myth and really understand it and all that sort of thing, you need to understand that the point of view about myth that they're going to likely have been socialized into in the politically correct environment of the university is going to be an attitude toward myth that does not view it as this kind of universal expression of human personalities that is grounded in especially not if it's grounded in any kind of deep structures. There's going to be a sort of a political, sociological, political, reductionistic, environmentalist, diffusionist interpretation. Finally, if they're really sophisticated, they will have become deconstructionists, and they'll tell you why no structures of meaning are structures of meaning, and that they're all created in the moment and have nothing to do with anything else. And therefore, there is no real basis to build any systematic theory of mythology on, because meaning is what you say it is. And they will say this in such beautiful French conceptual forms that you will be so intimidated that you will tend to say, God, I didn't realize how stupid I am. I really thought I knew a little something about mythology and its role in human life, but now I know that was totally pretension on my part, and that this person with all these credentials really understands. So I should throw out all my Campbell books because he's not popular with those people, and throw out all my Eliade books because he's not popular with all those people, and they don't, so forth. I'm serious about that, and, you can laugh about it or get really angry about it. I prefer to just kind of laugh about it and talk about them to their face when I can. But anyway, the point of it is, just be clear about this. The point of view that I'm going to be arguing for and articulating today is consistent with this tradition from Bastian through Eliade and Campbell and others, through Jung, through Anthony Stevens, and people like him, and other people who continue to believe that there is such a thing as an objective psyche, that there is such a thing as a collective unconscious, that it is species-wide, and I and some others believe that we can explain the reasons why that myths are not the same. that all structures in myths are not the same. And we're going to be getting into that today. Why don't all creation myths emphasize the same things? See? Yes?
What about Freud? Apart from deep structures and collective unconscious, he had the same premise and surely.
Yes. Freud, absolutely, but it's a very mixed bag there. Freud really emphasized mythological collective elements in the unconscious until Jung started really pushing that. Subsequent Freudians, they do not want to admit that they are pushing collective elements in the unconscious. And now they are pushing it even more than ever. And this afternoon we can talk about their recent discovery that there's a blueprint in the self on which the human self is developed, that is prior to personal experience. But anyway, you're absolutely right. Freud was fascinated, you might even say compulsively fascinated, with mythology. Based the whole thing on a very limited myth, but I would want to be the first to say that Freud was certainly right in pointing out Oedipal issues, that Oedipal themes, as you will, if you study creation myths, you know Oedipal themes come up a lot in creation myths, and it's not just the Greek creation myths. Yeah.
Back in the day, what Mike was talking about, these patterns and chaos, doesn't synchronicity also played in there? Because I was just thinking, almost reminds me, it heralds the emergence of a pattern coming out.
Yeah.
And again, that would be something that they would want to die and come off and
Yeah.
say this was it.
Yes. That's right. She's saying that contemporary concerns with synchronicity and chaos, such as that my colleague John Van Edenwyk has been working on, point to these great integrated themes too. But typically, a lot of people in some of these intellectual circles are not, that they're not into constructing great systems of thought. Today is not the day where it's popular to do systematic thinking. There used to be a time in philosophy where it was popular to do large integrative systems. Hegel, for example. Whitehead was the last great. Whitehead's thought is the last great metaphysical integrative system. Now in philosophy, it is popular. The real popular thing is to break everything down to bits. See what I mean? You can't even talk about this stuff without. So anyway, let me go on because we don't want to belabor that too long. Let me just continue on a minute, and then hold on to your questions, and we'll come back and pick them up in a minute. But anyway, so if you take what I consider to be a view of myth that is grounded in this tradition, then we have to remember this thing that Bastian started. We look at these expressions in myth wherever we can find them, and we say, now what are the elementary ideas that seem to come out of this hardwiring? And so if you get one set of myths that raise these themes, and you get another set that raise these others, and you find some overlapping with different traditions, then you start saying, wow, we better start doing some wide studies in world mythology. In other words, why study world mythology? Why not just study Greek mythology? And so you start thinking, well, could it be that there will be some important human themes that emerged in Indian culture that did not get selected out in Greek culture, and so forth, Native American culture, so forth. And so if you view the world of mythological productions in a way that is parallel to the way a Jungian today would view looking at dreams. For example, someone like Louise Motti, who is very interested in dreams around the world on particular issues, she is interested in knowing, for example, if she's studying dreams about nuclear war, she's not just interested in having people in Kankakee dreams. She would like to know the dreams of people in Russia, in Japan, South America, and so forth on these issues. So she can put all these things together and look and see if you can talk about the way in which the psyche of human beings in different cultures dream about these issues. So we would look at this in a parallel way. In other words, you don't throw out mythologies. You don't ignore mythologies if you can help it. Now, this gets us to a problem for our community today, our Jungian community, and I don't mean just the analyst. I mean there has been in recent years de-emphasis on serious comparative mythological studies. I mean serious comparative mythological studies, where people really spend some time doing digging through the available materials. This is a time when we have more resources in this than we've ever had before. And this is a time when so many Jungians are doing other things other than working on trying to study these materials from the collective unconscious. I think we have to, I like to say to people, when I went to that Paris International recently, there were very few papers that addressed any serious research into world mythology or world ritual or so forth as scientific databases. Now that is not Jungian. When you can have an international conference and nobody's doing any serious work in Jung's tradition on that. So the challenge for us in the next 50 years is for us to have people seriously broaden the mythological databases from which we look at things in a psychological way. We're too dependent on Greek mythology in the Jungian community. And so we are now doing a lot more with Native American, and that is good. And that will broaden things out. I've been sort of immersed in Navajo mythology in recent years. But so there's an enormous challenge here for us to widen. If you believe that these traditions have psychological wisdom and psychological understanding that we can put together and study synoptically and come up with more understanding of these deep structures, then the study of mythology is important. It's a tremendous challenge. Now somebody had a question or comment before we go on. Mike, did you want to say something in that?
Yeah, I did. See if I can get a hold of this. It was sort of on this question of meaning. I don't see that, because there seems to be like as if there has to be an a priori existence of meaning, as opposed to human beings ascribing meaning. Like there's two camps.
Yeah, that's right. There are many camps. There are camps that say there's no such thing as meaning.
My question is, what's the difference?
There's an enormous difference. Has enormous difference for clinical purposes, for psychotherapy. For example, if you are working with someone who's dying, and you have an existentialist point of view or a deconstructionist point of view about death, okay, but I'm just saying, I want to touch this, and then we have to go on, because we could spend months dealing with that issue. But it's like if there is no human wisdom about death that this ape has figured out over 1 million years, that is somehow within, then it might be a little more frightening to face death if you had to reinvent it all over again, and there's absolutely nothing you can learn from listening to your dreams that connect you with the wider tree from which you have sprung. So it matters greatly. The tension between an existentialist, a reductionistic existentialist view of meaning, and a Jungian approach to meaning is radical. It's a radical gulf there. Okay, but let me go on now. So this is an enormous challenge, and of course it's very overwhelming. Let me suggest that one of the reasons that people stay away from this stuff, and actually stay away from Jungian psychology, is because once they become aware that in order to do Jungian work on these issues, you really have to do cultural studies. And you can't just go to a Native American dance once or twice, you know. Or like some of the New Age types do, they go to a festival and get a feather, you know, illegal feather usually, and do a few little things, and they think they've got Native American stuff down, but never doing any serious work in any particular tradition. That is to say, getting really deep into Navajo, or really deep into Apache, or really deep into Sioux mythology and so forth. So this is a magician issue in my view. That is to say, if your magician aspect in yourself is not real self-confident, if it has not been nurtured and blessed so that you feel pretty capable of moving around in all this stuff and not getting lost, then when you run up against this kind of challenge to study mythology in order to inform the way you think psychologically, you'll be a little overwhelmed by that. Some of you will be overwhelmed, others will be overstimulated. You'll think, oh my God, what a banquet. Can't wait to get my fingers into it. Which one am I going to start with first? See? And those are really different responses. Some will be just totally overwhelmed, cut off, and they'll decide to become a behaviorist. Then you don't have to think about anything much. You know? Well, when they come to me and they tell me what they want to change, I can help them do it. Right. A lot of us psychoanalytic therapists could learn a little of that, because often we can't tell them how to do anything. So I'm not knocking behavioral therapy. I'm just talking about the attitude toward myth. I mean, you get into something which does not require too much complexity of thinking. You can reduce to simple schemas, behavioral schemas. And what I'm suggesting to you is that this is something you got that is a real factor in human psychology. This tendency to be overwhelmed and then move into simplification quick. Let's move into, if it's true, it's got to be simple. You run into all these people say, well, I know if it's really important and it's really true, it can be said real simply. Well, that's a sort of a discouraged magician talking. You know. I know that running an atomic plant has got to be easy. That's sort of the American or the Russian view, actually, of running atomic plants. Okay, so in other words, this is a big problem, and I have a particular interest in this these days. Some of us in the room work a lot with men's groups and so forth, and there's all this ferment around the country and now around the world about mythopoetic stuff with men. And so it's a big problem there. These men who work, they're not college professors, many of them. They are men from all walks of life, and they run into this issue that mythology is important. So how do you deal with that? Say you have a men's group, it's 10 men in it. Well, isn't this something that's far beyond their ken? They could never begin to work with mythology. I mean, after all, ordinary folk who actually work for a living, you know, can they have anything to do with myth? And, so the fantasy that a lot of people have about, we'll get off this and go on in a minute, but the fantasy that a lot of people have is that if you're into mythology, you have to have that big 2-volume dictionary that Wendy Doniger just helped to edit from the French guy that's, cost you a couple $100, and that's where you start. See, and if you're intimidated by that, you might as well go to some other school of thought. But I came prepared today to show you that this is not exactly the case. I am for the tape. I'm holding up the Cliff Notes on mythology. So all of you people out there who are intimidated by all these folks who like to parade themselves as great scholars of mythology, there are Cliff Notes for you. In other words, if we're going to have an impact in the world, we have to have a little more populist attitude about this. That is to say, people have to be encouraged that, yes, even you, even I can study mythology. And I'm not just joking here. This is a fine little introduction. And if you hadn't got it, you might want to get it. Egyptian, Introduction to Mythology, Egyptian mythology, Babylonian, Indian, Greek, Roman, Norse, excuse me, go ahead.
Some of us already have those books behind those big important looking ones.
That's good. An honest person.
That means we can take them out now, huh?
That's right. I affirm, one of the things is, see, how do you learn mythology? Any way you can. Any way you can. And you gotta get this. This is not something that belongs to people with 3 PhDs. This belongs to human beings. You see, the thing about it is, before we got so hyper-professionalized, who was it that were the experts in mythology? It was storytellers, but who told the stories? The elders in the tribe. Was that just 1 or 2 folks? No. The older men and the older women stewarded these stories for their tribe. And that means for us, if we were to model that, and I think we must model that today again, that means that every carpenter and every bricklayer and every steel worker and so forth and so on, every waitress, every so-and-so, needs to have, in my view, not one mythology that they study. They should try to get an overview of these things, but they should take upon themselves to learn 2 traditions fairly well. Because in the context of a women's group working on these issues, or a men's group, or a Jungian group, you can share your knowledge. So if you got 10 people, it's possible that you might have some familiarity with major human themes in 15 or 20 traditions. Now that is not only possible, I'm not just making this up, this is already being done all over the place today. And so it's very important for us to get this thing out of the idea that if you weren't a member of Eranos, the circle of Jung and his intellectual elite, then myth is not for your study. Yes, Mary.
I thought I had read in the Trickster book I read on, if I'm mistaken, I thought they had said in there, it was talking about the Indians, at least a group of them, and that they had, their storytelling, their stories, it was like, if I remember, that a certain person would be selected to carry a particular story, and it might pass down one way. They could even sell it, I think, I got the idea. They could pass it on to somebody else, and so that person, or a couple people would...
Oral tradition. See, this whole thing about the oral tradition, if you don't know about that, that's something you should try to learn about. Because before the emergence of print and books, human beings memorized these stories and they memorized them in enormous detail, and they passed them on. In fact, the stories did not change much at all over long, long periods of time. When you get books, then people don't have to pay attention anymore. That's the theory. And then we get television, and you don't have to pay attention at all anymore. See. But what I'm suggesting, and this is not just to me, this is not merely a sort of an ancillary sort of unimportant issue. We need to do this. We need to do this so that human beings around the world have a sense of ownership of these traditions. That they don't belong to the Zuni, they don't belong to the Apache, they don't belong to the Zulu. That these peoples have stewarded them and kept these Old Testaments for the world community. We need to cultivate that attitude, and we need to do our part. So when we're studying mythology, if you see it as important as a key to understanding the human potential, the human psychology, the human spiritual trust, then it is a part of all of our common tasks to do. And this is why it's exciting to see what's happening among working people throughout the United States. Yes?
See, I was sitting here puzzling in my head about how do you go out and preach the gospel to every creature.
Yes.
And there are two places I can think of, really archetypal places, where myths occur that I'm familiar with. One of them is in my deer camp up in Camden, Arkansas, where we got a group of guys, and it's the most exclusive club in the world. You can get in if they like you, if they don't like you, don't get in. And that's it. And
I'm not going to ask you what happens if you come up the trail and you hadn't been invited.
Seriously invited back out.
Yes, that's right.
The other is Union Hall, or its larger area, the industrialized plant. That plant has got myth running through it, and you sit at it, you scratch your head. You've been reading it for 20 years. Why you say, "My God, there it occurs."
Yes, that's right.
And then if you get into the more formalized area, when you get into the Union Hall, and you read the papers they turn out, you see the material they're turning out, and you say, "Wait a minute, I was there with those events. These aren't those events."
Yes.
But they are the same events that occurred 5, 10, 15 years ago in this same plant.
Yes.
As it is turned out.
Now you're talking about the mythological imagination, the way human beings can't stop mythologizing.
So
That's right.
When you said man is a mythologizing animal, I thought, my word, that is entirely right. But
Women too.
But in both places, I would find myself helpless to be able to talk about it not.
Yes, but see, the thing that you need to be aware of is that what is happening around all over this country and increasingly other places is that people who would have been 50 years ago intimidated by any kind of study of myth are studying it with great enthusiasm now. And I'm just suggesting that what worked for 1,000,000 years, we might want to take a look at that. It might be a good idea not to let a bunch of puer, would-be successful professors be the only ones that get to study this stuff. I mean, it might be a good idea, and we'll see later today why not only is it a good idea, not only can we do it, in my view, we better do it, and we better do it sooner rather than later, because myth, as I will argue this afternoon, is getting into and relating to the mythological imagination is one of the very few, maybe you can think of others, I have a hard time thinking of others, but it's one of the very few ways in which you can connect with grandiose archetypal energies, gold energies, in your psyche, and thereby not be depressed, without having it make you crazy, without having it turn you into a psychotic or an addict, or move into a depressive psychosis. Now, moderns major in depression. I mean, if you're really culturally modern, the probability is that you are severely depressed. lot of sociopathic, you know, especially if you do not have the financial means to afford to be very depressed. And folks, one of the things I recommend to those of you who are culturally middle class and are upper middle class is to go out and spend some time in working communities and in the mental health centers in the working communities and see where the folks have to struggle, because these are heavily dominated by class. A lot of these issues are heavily dominated by class, and we have to move against that business. I mean, that cannot, you know, psychology cannot be allowed, psychological sophistication cannot and should not be allowed to simply be the province of those who have some money. And that can be changed and should be changed, is not being changed now. Okay.
Can I ask you
yes.
the problem of relativizing religion? It seems to me that the great difficulty, which you haven't touched on,
Yes.
is that we are prepared to regard Navajo myths as their myths.
Yes.
But Christianity, that's different.
Well, that depends on your hermeneutics. I have a whole series of lectures on tribalism and human spirituality, which the Institute has. And what I think about that is in that series of lectures. And it's a complicated business, but I'm not interested in becoming a theosophist. I have nothing against the theosophists. I think they're an interesting group. But I don't think the answer for our planet is a new theosophy where we get all the myths together and then we boil them and we have myth soup. You know, I don't think that's the answer. I think every tradition must steward its uniqueness, and that's why I say there's no such thing as generic Native American. You know, Sioux is not Navajo. Mescalero Apache is not Zuni. And so we need to have much more serious stewarding of specific traditions of each group. And so I don't see a necessary conflict between whether or not you steward your tradition. The question is, what do you do with it? Who do you steward it for? Are you a hopeless tribalist that's intending to impose your particular tribal vision on the entire planetary community? In my view, if you are part of the problem for the human race, and I'm going to work against you with everything at my disposal, because tribalism is the cause of the greatest threats of history, the greatest Holocaust in human history, and it is right now threatening all of our safety in this planet. So if we don't come up with a way in which we can honor people's diversity and have them bring their tradition for the widest human community, we don't have a chance. And I mean in the fairly short run with nuclear proliferation going like it is. So this stuff is not simply academic, a nice little Jungian preoccupation for the Jungian institutes and these friends of Jung's groups to major in and have as their tribe. See, what we need to be doing is seeing that this is human psychology, not Jungian psychology, and that this is for everyone, and we have to be about trying to make this available in a wider way, and that's why Jungian institutes have public programs and don't just train psychoanalysts, in my view. And why we put so much energy in this institute into this. We believe that this is for everyone, not just for somebody that's going to have a high-priced clientele. So anyway, let's take a short break, and then let's come back at 15 after, and we'll get into you're going to give us your phenomenology of themes and motifs and creation myths. We'll let you display your virtuosity here. Let's give the examples that you're familiar with about how the world came into being. And this, if you've got some different traditions that you can draw on, let's just get a few of those out. There are so many of these things. Let me recommend that you look at Charles Long's book Alpha, Myths of Creation. And here's a little book that the Institute is selling on creation myths by David McLagan, Man's Introduction to the World. It's a good little survey and lots of pretty pictures, which are not irrelevant if you think that the structures and images that have been created have some significance. But anyway, there's so many of these things, but let's get a few out. So let's just have the courage to be imperfect, and let's name the tradition and then say how the world was created, just in terms of the fundamental image of creation. Anybody? What? Just name the tribe or the tradition. And
I see what Joseph Campbell told about the creation story. Africa is told by the snake.
The story is told, the creation story is told from the view of a snake. Okay? Snakes often appear in the story. Others. Let's we all know the Genesis creation stories.
I read an afternoon where there was a web that was made up to the heavens, and I believe that's how, like, from the heavens came, like, the creatures, basically.
A web was made up to the heavens.
And the main characters were the spiders and the ants to start with. They were the first sort of like beings, so to say.
Okay. So there was a web of creation. It was an African story. A web of creation, and the first creatures came down, climbing down the web. Others? Huh?
Greek egg.
The Greek egg. Another one. This whole idea about the creation of the world from the egg is a very, very wide-ranging image that you see if you study creation myths. That is an image of undifferentiated unity and potential. That's very widespread. Others? Yes, back here.
The Australian Aborigine about song, that in a book called Songlines by James Chapman, and that the beings that of creation came down into the earth and sang every living rock and being.
Let me say this for the tape before you go on. She's talking about Australian Aborigines who have a view of the earliest creation being by singing, of the world having been sung into existence. Go ahead.
So as a result, each person is given a song that he or she must keep with him and pass on, because if he does not, then a piece of creation has been lost.
Isn't that a powerful image? Now, give me the name of that book so that I can put that on the tape.
Chapman, C-H-A-T-W-I-N.
James Chatwin, C-H-A-T-W-I-N.
Songlines.
Songlines, one word, about Australian Aborigines' view of creation. Let me say a little bit about singing. It's very intriguing when you start studying comparative creation myth, because singing very often is a big important aspect of creation. You see this a lot in Native American traditions, particularly the view of the medicine persons as singers, and in a lot of the native traditions. I'll tell you a story about that a little bit later, but let's get a few more of these out. And if you want to recommend a book, we'll put that on the tape too for people. Other stories, other traditions, yes.
I may fall flat on my face because I have a feeling there are going to be some people that are going to know an awful lot more.
Well, go ahead and fall flat on your face.
From the Hindu art book, I began to get the idea that there is a Hindu belief that the world emanated from sound. And at first the unstruck sound, and then the struck sound into light, and then into primary color, and from color into geometric form, and then to form as we perceive it.
Okay, she's talking about Hindu traditions of the world forming from sound, and that gradually the world, from this sound, different structures and different aspects of being emanate. Now that is let me just say a word about that. That's a very widespread notion, particularly in the East. The Buddhist traditions have a lot of that same kind of emphasis. And if you study Tibetan Buddhism in particular, it's no accident that people who are trying to bring about Shambhala, which is sort of the apex of the creation, chant, ring bells, have certain sounds that need to be played on horns. In fact, if you listen to, you can get a lot of this music now from the Tibetan Buddhist community and listen to these chants and these sounds. But it's Hindu and Buddhist visions of the importance of sound. Yes?
Does that have anything at all to do with, in the New Testament, it says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was of God, I think.
The New Testament idea, she's speaking of this idea of the creation issuing from Logos, which was interpreted in a sort of a Hellenistic way as it was word, but it had much more of a sense than we have today about the creative emanation of words. So it would be related more to the creative sound, the creative voice. You know, in Genesis, and God said. Say that again?
The deed is an alternative definition for logos.
Yes, the deed, she's saying, is an alternative definition for logos. So there is this sense of this. Now, there's one thing I want you to flag now to context a lot of these things, and that's the issue of power. What is power, see, in the context? Because now, if you think about this whole issue, and when I talk about Eliade before lunch, more in terms of his views on this, we'll see the importance of what is power, what is powerful, what is the relationship between creation and power, and what is the relationship between creation, myth, and empowerment. So hold on to that, and then think now what we've been talking about. Singing as power, empowerment through singing, empowerment through listening to the sound, empowerment through the word. See? So all of these things have this sense of this. What you've got to try to get a feel for today is the incredible fullness of power that these creation myths are trying to communicate. We contacted at the time of creation. See? Yes, Mary.
So you can tie into that the wind, the breath, the spirit, the Holy Spirit.
The wind, the breath, the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. You were.
I was just going to comment that the only way that lessons could be conveyed before literacy was through orality. So the importance of sound to all these cultures and the primacy of myth has a lot to do.
Here again, she's emphasizing what we were talking about before the break about oral tradition. When we talk about oral tradition, it's not just these people didn't know how to write or didn't know how to have printing. See, that doesn't get it. You got to have a sense of their understanding of the word, the voice, the breath of life, the breath of creation, and this sense of incredible potency that is so powerful. The parallels that we have today, you just have to think, we have to think about some metaphors later today for this kind of power, for an experience. Hierophany, cratophany. Now, remind me to come back to hierophany, cratophany, all these, epiphany. What do we mean by epiphany? And because we've got to have a feeling for that today. You've got to try to get a feeling for that. It's not enough to think about it. You have to try to feel that in your body, what this kind of power is, because this is what this creation stuff is about. Yeah.
What were those words? Hierophany, epiphany, Christ?
Kratophany. I will put them on the board later. Okay, if you just remind me. Yes.
What about starting over myth, like in Noah in the ark? You know, with that, it's not, you know, starting from the beginning, but
She's raising this issue of starting over in sort of the issue of recreation. Now, hang on to that. You've just put your finger on one of the most important themes that Eliade emphasizes and talks about. And we're going to have to ask the question today, this morning, when we talk about Eliade about that, so don't let us forget to come back to that. And then this afternoon, when we're talking about psychology, we need to raise this question. Now, could it be that this issue of human beings talking about starting over has something to do with our experience psychologically? I don't know if any of you ever fragmented, but I have been known to fragment occasionally. And we need to talk this afternoon about the relationship between fragmentation, disintegration products in the psychology of the human self, and creation myths. Because one of the things this afternoon that we'll get to is, I really think that this is primal self-psychology. The creation mythology is primal, primordial, self-psychology. That they knew about what it was like to try to live and try to maintain a self in the face of history. And in the face of all the traumas that we run into every day, like trying to find a parking place, you know? When I approached that parking space this morning, and I drove up there and I put my quarters in it, and they came out the little thing, and I put them in, and then they came out again, and I put them in a third time. I'm not too quick, you know. And I put them, and then I read the sign that says cards only, which is a new thing. See, I did not feel particularly affirmed. My narcissism and my grandiosity was not met with attuned empathy. It didn't matter that I was the speaker today. Go ye unto another parking lot, right? So I really did not find that a very an experience which affirmed my grandiosity. Did not help me relate to it well. I became depressed and depleted for a few minutes. I'm not kidding you. And this is where we live. And we need to start monitoring these ways in which our created self comes to an end in some of these, or at least it begins to shake a lot. And we need to think about this in terms of self-psychology this afternoon. But let's get a few more of these. Yes, right here.
There are also a series of myths, and I know that there are some African myths and there are some Native American ones where the world is not exactly created, but it has to be reached, where beings negotiate various levels until they reach the world as we know it.
She's saying that there are some myths where the emphasis in the earliest myths is not about creating the world, but it's finding some way to get to the world. Now that's intriguing, especially if you spend any time thinking about the structure of the self. That is to say, could it be? See, could it be? Now I'm not even going to talk about my model of the self there, but we just use Kohut. Could it be that this is some intuition in human beings about a cohesive self-organization? That being a human in a body is one thing, and arriving at what Kohut calls a cohesive self-organization is radically a different issue. See, we don't know, but it might have something to do with that. That is, the idea of getting there. This also, I think, relates to that Christian idea of sin as hamartia, falling short of the mark. Not so much what you did, is that you're not there yet. Where are you not? What is this mark? Well, it may have something more to do with self-psychology than people have thought. Okay, but other stories. Yeah, John.
Well, this is a creation myth that relates both to fragmentation and sound, and that's the Big Bang Theory.
He's talking. John is a scientist. He's bringing up this Big Bang Theory as a myth. That would take you. If we had time for you to talk about that, we could talk about that all day, couldn't we? The mythological elements of different cosmologies in contemporary physics. Yeah.
There's alternative
So,
theories now.
I was remembering creation myth of the 40s, which I had, which was the world spun off the sun, the planet spun off the sun. I think there's continual revision of mechanistic, I guess, creation myths.
Okay, John is really highlighting this, and we don't have time to really do much with it today, except just to record that cosmologies in contemporary physics, if humans tend to be the mythologizing animal, that will express itself in their physics, their images of paradigms in physics. And I think it was the other day when we were talking that I said that I think that even the choice of 4 couples for staffing the Mars mission is really based in the mythic imagination and not in anything particularly practical or scientific, but is a mythical underlying layer in scientific reflection on this. Okay, others. Come on, let's try to get some other cultures in here. Yes?
Thinking. Creation by thinking.
What tradition?
Well, I've seen this in Grimble's Pattern of Islands. I think von Franz quotes it.
Von Franz quotes something about creation from thinking.
Thinking.
Yes.
As consciousness.
Yes.
Does that seem to be real or an illusion in the world? If the world is created by thinking,
Sorry?
if the world is created in this myth by thinking, is the world considered to be an illusion or something that's manifest?
No, it wasn't the world, actually. The world was created, and then the primal, in this myth, the primal God, who later disappeared, thought and had the concept of a man.
Yes.
Did he not? And then he thought and had the concept of a woman.
Yeah, the question for the tape, the question is being raised about if thinking is the origin of the world, then is the world an illusion, or is there some sense in which it's real? We should say that there are different traditions about this. Yeah. That some view that when the high god or the primary god or goddess thinks the world, that it is a sort of an illusionary thing, maya, that it is sort of the dance of illusion, a dreamlike thing that one wakes up from. Others, though, it's the divine imagination idea, that creativity is grounded in the divine imagination, and so in God's thinking things, they come into being. So there is that motif too. So there are both of those sides of that thing. And of course it would have to do with one of the things you always want to ask in any theory, what is their view of bondage, of the soul, and what is their view of liberation? Because usually they have some understanding of what binds the soul from its goals and what could liberate it. So all these ideas of maya, illusion, and so forth are parts of their psychology. Okay, other myths, other traditions, yes?
African myth that I just heard yesterday as the creator as both male and female, and the male created the heavens and the female created life and the female aspect of the creator, and then and made a mistake, which
Who did? The female did?
we are imperfect, but therefore it's okay that we're imperfect. So it really has a forgiveness component.
She's talking about an African myth that she heard at a conference yesterday about division of duties by male and female in the creative process, which we might note in terms of motifs. That's a big theme. Gender issues, usually a very heavy theme in these creation stories. How did the relationship between the genders get set up? What happened? And if it's been told from a patriarchal perspective, very often you find ways to blame the things that go wrong on the female. And we've heard of that somewhere in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Right? Have we? And this afternoon, if you'll remind me, I will comment on how that sort of fearful, panicky fantasy on the part of the male psyche can probably be explained in terms of the structure of the self. But anyway, others, yes.
Well, it's probably a good time now to bring up the Egyptian myth of
Yes.
Isis and Osiris.
Yes.
And as far as I understand it, the masculine is recreated by the feminine.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's one of the only myths I know of where that actually happens in that way.
She's talking about the Egyptian myth of Isis and Osiris and emphasizing the regeneration of the masculine by the feminine. Anything else you want to add about that? Egyptian mythology, if you want, Egyptian mythology is so wonderful because one of the things I love is looking at these really, the old, go back as far as possible, get the oldest possible traditions which you still have information about. See, a lot of our traditions have been wiped out, and a lot of the information has just disappeared. But we have a lot of information about Egyptian traditions. One of the ones I like about the Egyptian tradition is this thing about that was the Memphis theology from Egyptian mythology, and that is this idea of the egg. The Egyptians also have this thing about the golden egg, and from it, different couples of gods coming forth. And that is the beginning of differentiation, and gender differentiation, different roles, different kind of human experiences come out of that egg. You get a lot of very old African mythology that we still have some awareness of, and much more work is being done on, from the Dogon to the Yoruba to the other tribes. But again, one of the reasons that I like to study Navajo traditions so much is that we have a lot of that stuff has been saved. I mean, we have enormous amounts of information about the Navajo mythology of creation and all sorts of other traditions. So some of these traditions are there for you in a richer way than others, and Egyptian is one of them. Others, let's get a couple more in, and then let's move to summarizing some of these motifs, and then let's turn to Eliade and get some of that Eliade stuff in before lunch. Yeah, Mike. Yes, I'm going to put that up in just a minute. Yeah.
I don't know how this. This is just a favorite myth of mine. I don't know if it's a creation myth or not, but the concept of the Word, or God gives man the Word, and then at some point, man, when people break the Word and then are isolated from, banished, and then the journey back, this kind of thing. It seems to be sort of...
It's a little Judeo-Christian, a little ancient Near East there. Now, one of the things you want to remember in this context is this paradise fantasy. Paradise fantasies are very widespread. The archetypal garden stuff is related to creation. And there is so much good scholarship that's been done on garden, paradise, images and so forth, and they are related to this kind of tradition. That is, when things were plentiful and rightly ordered. You know, back when things were plentiful and rightly ordered, see. So there's that sense. Any others that you can think of before we move on? Yes.
I don't know where to say this comes from, maybe my own imagination, but
Okay, we're going to have a creative myth, as Campbell would say here. Go ahead.
At all. But a sense of God giving birth to the world.
Birthing. I think there are many traditions. There are many traditions in which this is in the context of birthing, and we're probably going to find a lot more of those when a lot more of the research into images of the feminine, the goddess contribution to creation. Well, look at Alpha Myths of Creation by Charles Long, and continue to get some sense of these things, and look at the book by von Franz on creation myths. It's a set of lectures she gave at the Institute in Zurich, Switzerland, and it's very provocative. She was is a wealth of information on these things, and is a good model, I think, for us. Von Franz had a lot of background in the study of the classics and mythology, and that's one of the great contributions she's made to our community and has continued to make. So look at her book on that too. Now let's do a little bit now on motifs that you see coming in these stories, and you've lifted up some of them, and this gender issues. And the whole issue of the conflict between men and women, creation myths will often talk about why conflict between men and women occur, and they will very often talk about how that conflict is reconciled. And they're just wonderful stories about, the men decided that women were a real problem, and so they just went off by themselves and just decided to just do without women, blah, blah, blah. And then they began to wonder about this, And you get that kind of theme, and they decided they'd go back and try to cooperate a little better. And so you get vice versa. You hear stories about that. So what other issues? Motifs, themes.
I don't know if I mentioned that a teardrop or dew is often the beginning of a world, from the deity's realm to manifestation.
Right. How does manifestation occur? That is, manifestation or emanation. That is, how do we get all this world, as the Buddhists say, of the 10,000 things? I mean, where does all this come from? And so there is a sense of there is this sense of the diversity, the origins of diversity and diversification. And that's a big issue. The origins of diversification. Now you need to think, for our purposes, about this afternoon, about this whole question of unity and diversity in the psyche. One of the things, if you study psychological testing, and you read MMPI profiles, or you read Rorschach profiles on people, one of the things that you will notice them picking up on is, when they're working with people, is how well this person relates to diversity. What does this person do when they're confronted with diversity and complexity? Can they engage living in a world which is diverse? Or does this frighten them so badly? In other words, does chaos threaten to creep in when I encounter diversity? And what do I do when I encounter this diversity? Do I just deny that it exists? A lot of people do. In fact, the less organized a personality is, we're into the afternoon's issues, the more denial of diversity there will be. You follow that? Now that's a fundamental, important political issue. You get me? Because we better help people deal with diversity without fragmenting in the world. Because when you don't, they retreat into fundamentalisms, which are attempts to oversimplify in the face of diversity. To maintain what? To maintain the structure of the self. That is, I cannot continue to function if you tell me it's that diverse. So don't confuse me with the facts about the way the world is. This is a big issue, and it is a self-issue. It's a self-psychology issue, and it's one that these creation myths always address. In fact, you get all these stories about, well, you know, how many animals are we going to create here, you know? And Crow said, no, we're not going to have any other kind of bird, you know. And Blue Jay agreed with him. Think about that. Other themes.
Dynamic and static.
Dynamic and static. Okay, now see, in other words, if we really had time, we would get into all these antinomies, right? All of these oppositions, dynamic and static. Give me a couple more.
Light and dark.
Right. Right. Get that? She says good and evil as a polarity. Now this is a biggie, and every creation myth that is very elaborated is going to talk about how evil gets into the human world. Who done it? See?
About water and earth. Or wet, dry.
Yes, wet, dry. Water, earth, but not just water, earth. Earth, air, fire, water. 4 elements. I mean, in traditions ranging way around the world, you get this 4 element stuff. 4 elements, 4 winds, 4 directions, etc., etc. So it's not just one opposition. That this diversification thing starts, and you start getting the struggle with quadration, which we can talk about later. Yeah.
When you get into that, you also get into that those fire, earth, water, and air, they'll break off into dualities that match up. Earth and water, fire and air go together.
She's saying that once this the duality to 4s, to 8s, to other patterns, and this is this fascination in human history with numerology. Numerology in relationship to what? Numerology in relationship to what is real. See, one of the things, we'll get into Eliade, and we're going to have to get into Eliade fast, but he talked, the issue, creation is always related to what is really real. See? And so whenever you're looking at any of these mythological motifs like numerology, that's talking about how do you connect with what is really real in the structure of things. See? Because there's an assumption there.
Something like certainty and uncertainty.
Yes, certainty and uncertainty, but there's really, this is all in that area of dynamic principles of yin and yang, and the dynamic principles of chaos and cosmos. And you have to ask the question, they're always talking about this relationship between chaos and cosmos. And a lot of people have thought, that cosmos is sort of fixed. It's not a dynamic concept. I think they're wrong about that. I think that all this talk about chaos being an ongoing principle in things is more related to this tension between structure and anti-structure that probably exists as a polarity in the ultimate nature of things. that deconstruction, I mean, I zap them a good bit, but, you know, deconstruction is an important move in life. And if you can't deconstruct something that needs to be deconstructed, then you're trapped in the old. And you can't go on with regeneration. So those people that emphasize deconstructing old patterns are holding up one end of the stick. Here, see.
So creativity and destruction is a necessary.
That's right. And you might, she says creation and destruction, and you might even want to phrase it, what role in creation does destruction have? See. Yes. She's raising this issue of Shiva and the dance of Shiva in creation and destruction. That's a wonderful mythological system. And you've raised another thing. We were talking earlier about singing the world into existence, you know, and all that so forth. Dancing the world into existence. You get all of this relationship of dance and creation, too. So anyway, it's a rich group of motifs and themes, but polarity is a big issue. How do the polarities come into existence, and then what do you do about them? How does diversification come in, and how do you find an adequate amount of unity in the context of diversity? Now, I want to suggest to you here again is that these are themes in self-psychology. These are all themes in self-psychology, and this afternoon we'll be thinking about this issue of building a self, if you think mythologically, is parallel to the issue of building a world. Creating a self and creating a world, in my view, are parallels. In fact, in my recent research, it's finally hit me that if you study mythological geography of cities, of worlds and cities, that you actually have a paradigm for the structural formation of the human self. That, in my view, is can be interpreted in the context of self-psychology, and would help us if a Jungian kind of point of view on this is right. Then when we look at these ancient mythological paradigms, we're seeing a projected form of the actual blueprints and structure of the deep self. Now, I believe that's literally true. And we will talk about some of the implications of that this afternoon. But let me I got 15 minutes to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that's Iliade, and let me write his name up here. Romania. He came from Romania, and let me just mention a few of the books. I actually think that for lay people working on this stuff, you know, people often ask me, well, what do I study in mythology? Who do I study? And I say, well, read all of Campbell's work and read all of Iliade's work. Time you got that, you got enough. You can get by if you've done that. See, in terms of approaches to this, and the reason I think it's important to read Iliade here, he was not, in my view, one of the greatest theoreticians in the world. That is, he did not elaborate theoretical models of the human psyche and soul and of mythology. What was he? He was one of the greatest catalogers and collectors of all time. And he collected information about these traditions. And one of the things that will strike you about his books and will bore you unless you know what you're doing is the way that he endlessly reiterates, in the blank, blank, blank of the blank, blank, blank culture, the people do this. And then in the blank, blank, blank culture of the blank, blank, blank culture, the people do this. And then he just lines them up. And he is just overwhelming you with data. But if you're looking to him for that, you won't say, this guy's, all he's doing is being repetitive. I mean, if you know that what you're looking for is evidence for patterns that he's trying to tell you about, then you won't get irritated with him and angry with him. You will find it a kind of a rich banquet. Oh, will tell me more about stone symbolism. And so the first book you want to look at is this book, Patterns in Comparative Religion. And where Eliade often, in his early career, he used the word archetypes a lot. Then he got to the University of Chicago, and he found out that Jung was not, to say the least, in at the University of Chicago. So then he started using the word structure. Structures. And so when you're reading Eliade's work and you come on the word structure and you're a Jungian, you can read that archetype. But let me list a few more books and then say a little bit about, pick up some of the themes you've already mentioned about Eliade's work in relation to this. You want to look at cosmos and history in the context that we're talking about today. Of course, the book The Sacred and the Profane. And the book Rites and Symbols of Initiation. And there are many, many, many others, but that gets you a sense of the eternal return, which we're going to come to now. Let me just outline a few of these ideas of Eliade. He emphasizes what happens in illo tempore, that is, in the beginning. So, creation mythology is at the center of his work. Charles Long was an Eliade student. So Long's book Alpha issued right out of his study with Eliade, and is based on the centrality of creation issues in Eliade's thought. Okay. Eliade assumed that peoples around the earth who were not modernized yet all assumed that the key to life lay in understanding what happened in the beginning, in illo tempore. And not only in understanding what had happened in the beginning, but in being able to connect once again with what happened in the beginning. See, it's not enough to know what happened back there then. For Eliade, in Eliade's understanding of human beings and the deep structures of mythology, his argument is that for peoples who are pre-modern homo religiosus, that is, religious human beings, or I would say mythological human beings, who lived in myth and through myth, that there was a constant attempt to return to connect with those spaces. And when we speak of sacred and profane space, we don't mean good and bad space, like moderns use those words. When we talk about sacred space and profane space, we're talking about the human need to find the center. Big word. Write this down for your understanding of creation myth. There is always, in Eliade's view, and I think you can find this in creation myth after creation myth, where can we find the center? Well, what is at the center? Well, maybe it's the world tree. Or maybe it's where the egg is. Or maybe it's where the web connects. Or maybe it's where the stepladder is. Or maybe it's where the cross of Christ is. Or maybe it's the Garden of Eden. And so on, and so on, and so on, elaborated through these various stories. But it's always a quest for what Eliade talked about as the axis mundi. That is, a center. What is there about the center? The center is always connected with the beginnings. Get this now. Let me just go through this. The center is always connected with the beginnings, which are always connected with power, fullness, energy, life, regeneration, renovation, renewal, etc., 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 and which one can only experience by reconnection to the center.
How about the eternal? Is that always the case?
The eternal return, as Eliade constantly uses the phrase, is his way of talking about the human experience in myth of always having to go back to in illo tempore, as the Aborigines say, to the dream time, or to sing your way back to the origins, or to and this is always related to ritual, remember? In mythical, when myth is living, you always are ritualizing. What are you ritualizing according to Eliade? You're ritualizing the return to the time when everything was new and fresh and full of power and productive and creative and flowing. So ritual was taking you back to the source of power for living. In other words, it isn't just power. According to Eliade, these human beings were interested in reconnecting with this power because they felt like the world was running down. It's what we call today depletion in psychoanalysis. You know, when you feel like you have no vigor, you're depressed, you have no energy, and I'm working with you and I say, well, now, what happened in your self-object surround to disappoint you, to put you into this fragmentation? See? So you can trace the historical event which led to your experience of the breaking up of your world, and therefore the loss, get it now, the breakup of your world and the loss of energy, the onset of depression, the onset of depletion, the lack of enthusiasm then, and no more ambition. When you are close to the energy of the beginning, you have ambition, enthusiasm for engaging the brave new world. When something has cracked your cosmos, all that energy disappears. And then you are not ambitious. Well, I was stupid to think I could ever amount to anything. Who am I? See? You follow that? Now that's Eliade is constantly in his work elaborating and documenting. And so when he's documenting this for you, just look at the footnotes. I love reading his footnotes because he had such an incredible richness of awareness of cultural materials that American scholars have lost touch with. So this constant return for refreshment, constant return to the center for regeneration and renewal, for what? For living. So this is a theme that he plays over and over and over again. Getting in touch with the sacred then for Eliade was recreation. For living, for human living. Let me stop there. We've got about 5 minutes and let you, for those of you that have not had any encounter with Eliade, to ask me questions for clarification about that. We'll come back to that stuff after this afternoon. So, comments or questions or reflections?
I just want to say, when you watch young children, you see this energy. It's all there. It's so amazing.
Yes.
And you say, where does it all go?
Yes. She's talking about the way in which children seem to be very in touch with this energy as young children, and then later on, as you know, we're so wonderfully creative as human beings, aren't we? I mean, we're able to turn alchemy into the idea of turning gold into lead. I'm not kidding you. Growing up in the world the way we've got it set up is turning gold into lead. And we even set up whole psychologies whereby if you have a sense of your gold energy, then you're really crazy. And we've got to get you out of that. We have got to get you to stop thinking that you're extraordinary and important, and you might be really important in some global way. And we've got to say, oh my God, look how archaic that grandiosity is that person has. They really think they might be important. We have got to do a lot of therapy many times a week with this person to help ground them into health, which is, you know, stopping that thinking they're extraordinary. And I'm not kidding you. And turning them into ordinary people and seeing this as the goal of psychotherapy. There are a lot of therapists who envy and hate their patients who show this gold. When Robert Bly talks about be careful showing your gold, that includes with your therapist, because they will often pathologize it. And you need, one of the things you need to notice with people you work with in therapy, is when you finally get around to showing your therapist that you think that you really might amount to something one day, and if they kind of look away or kind of yawn right at that moment, you're dealing with a therapist that has not dealt with their own narcissistic issues, which is most of us. Most of us, if we're honest, are still dealing with our narcissistic issues. And one of the wonderful contributions that we'll get into this afternoon of Kohut and self-psychology, they have led us to a revolutionary change in the attitude toward this grandiose energy in the self.
This ties up with the myth of the divine child.
Yes, it does. He says that this ties with the myth of the divine child, and it certainly does. And you see, we live at a time in history, and then we can just stop for lunch with this. We live at a time in history that is so critical and so full of potential and danger. A great deal of what has happened to our species is that we have come up in cultures, all cultures that I've ever been able to find are shame cultures. All these people talk about finding guilt cultures as opposed to shame cultures. I want them to show me a culture that's not a shame culture, because we are tremendously heavily defended against acceptance of this gold energy in people. And this afternoon we'll talk about some of the reasons why we are, because this gold energy is also behind evil. Just a minute, let me finish this. And we have the opportunity now, though, if we could come back at this thing again and kind of rethink this in a fresh way, it is possible that we could address people's narcissistic needs in a healthier way. And it's possible that we might learn to help them ritualize once again around their grandiosity, their gold energy, so that they can use it more for the human, think Eliade here, that we can go back to that gold energy of the beginnings and get in touch with that and put it in service of human life and the planet. I get zapped a lot because people think that the idea that we could in fact survive on this planet is a grandiose idea. I get attacked a lot for believing that we actually might win the war for our planet's ecological systems. And there are a lot of people that when I say that, they get into their shame issues immediately.
So grand is grandiose in the way most people view it.
I want you to notice, if you were talking with a group of people and you let them know that you think that we might actually solve the population explosion problem, that we might actually reforest the planet, that we might actually educate children, that we might actually have clean water for everybody on Earth. I want you to notice that they will tend to respond to you like you're in a messianic inflation. I want to ask you what happens when history puts you in a place where if more people don't get into messianic inflations, human history is going to end. I think that's an interesting thought. So in my view, if we don't learn how to put people back in touch with this gold energy so that they can feel like what they do is important. See, if we don't do that, in my view, we're going to lose. And what is going on in an enormous epidemic all around the world in many different issues is going to continue. I was listening to a report this morning. I spent some wonderful time traveling around in the Philippines recently. But I was so aware of how the Filipino people have been exploited and abused by their leadership, as well as everybody else in the world. And I heard a report this morning about the way in which the Filipino nation is stripping itself of forest, natural resources, devastating the ecology, the population explosion. They're going to double their population again in a very short time if we do not help them with birth control. And so these things, see, we're facing a situation. The Filipino people do not have long to get this right. And this is repeated time and again around the world. So these issues, is it hopeless for the Filipino people? Is it hopeless? See? Now, there are a lot of people that want to wash their hands on that. But see, I don't believe it's hopeless for the Filipino people. It may soon become hopeless. But it's not now. So with that little light thing to give you some indigestion, let's take a break and let's come back and start promptly at about a 1:45. Let's get started into some of the psychological reflection on this stuff. And let me just start, let me start with that. Why don't we just say right now, you've had lunch to kind of mull around some of these things, and why don't you say the question you have louder for the group?
I think it'd be really helpful if we could make a distinction between the healthy narcissism that you were talking about, getting the gold energy, and the unhealthy pathological narcissism.
Yeah. He's raising a question of how one would distinguish between healthy narcissism or grandiosity or connection with the gold and pathological forms, and we should directly address that in this context this afternoon. Other things that came to you when you were ruminating over lunch. Yes.
The last illustration you drew of the center, I wonder if you could comment on the human view of the center, and also in various cosmologies the view that the center doesn't have needs or desires, so doesn't need humans for that.
Question about the issues about the center, the importance of this concept of the center, and different views of that, whether the divine center has needs or not, as an issue. We'll get you to elaborate that more a little bit. Others, yes.
How does in that model that you drew of the center that Ilya referred to, is that like the archetypal self, the diamond body, that kind of business?
Yeah, I mean, is this center the archetypal self, the diamond body? In my view, it is. That is to say, psychologically speaking, when we're talking Jungian and we say we're going to make an ego archetypal self-axis or healthy connection, it is a way of saying, well, I've got to figure out how I'm going to relate to this thing in me that is a sort of a God self diamond. And so I know I'm connected with it, but that I don't get into any kind of archaic identification with it. It makes me psychotic. Yes?
What about the problem of eternal return and the idea that we're in a developmental process at which there are critical moments never again to be repeated?
Yes. She's raising the question about this concept of eternal return versus what it would be like a more of the historical point of view, that sort of a Judeo-Christian view of history, where there's Heilgeschichte, salvation history, where there is fulfillment, kairos, important moments that are not repeatable. Yeah, and we should come back to this because it is particularly important in terms of this topic. You see, in terms of the creation myths in the context of self-psychology. Because it would be one way to phrase that would be like, well, now what is the relationship between coming back to reintegrate your self-structure when you're fragmenting and the whole individuation process? So we come back to that because that's an important question, and one I think we can address with some clarity. Yes, back in there is a very high expectation possibilities of the human future. Yes, back here. Somebody? Okay. Yeah?
Could you say a little bit more about the connection between the new physics and myth? Came up just a little bit.
I will give you a commercial about, what about the connection between new physics and myth? I'll give you a commercial on a new book that's coming out in this Jungian World Spirituality series that I edit. It's a book by John Hitchcock, and it is on the topic Jungian psychology, the new physics, and human spirituality. And he will be addressing in that book, should come out within a year, that thing in some detail. Yes, Mary?
Tying in with these other questions, with this renewal or fragmentation, can you tie that, it's almost obvious, can you tie that in with dismemberment concept and initiation?
Yes. Yes. What's the difference between fragmenting and being dismembered in an initiatory context? Or what's the relationship between the two? I think we'll see that there's a relationship between the two. The question is sort of like this. Well, is there any way you can regulate your grandiosity, break it up in such a way that doesn't destroy it, make it unavailable to you? See, this is a problem that most of the human species has not figured out. We think that either you got it or you don't. And the idea of metabolizing grandiosity in a 120-volt form is kind of hard for us to get, but it's an important question, so we'll address that. Oh, well, you're really in all these areas we have to touch on. So let me just jump into going over some of these issues in the context, thinking about the psychological implications of these. And to start out, let's go back to this issue of kratophany in the context of creation myth. K-R-A-T-O-P-H-A-N-Y, kratophany. In other words, all creation myths are stories about the manifestation of power, effective power, power which makes a world. And Eliade has been the one. Eliade was not the only one. I mean, the great phenomenologist Gerhard van der Leeuw, in his book Religion in Essence and Manifestation, talked a lot about religion as manifestation of power. So you should look at that too. But creation myths are about this manifestation of a power which forms worlds. But get this, and think about it from a psychological point of view. The world is formed, and all of a sudden something goes wrong. There's something. I mean, you form this world, but splits occur. Evil manifests fairly soon, if not immediately. Now, isn't that interesting? See, practically universal. So we have to think about this stuff psychologically. What is that about? What is that about? The power which creates is the power which fragments, goes into all this staggering diversification, begins to split in such ways that you even get tremendous encounters with the demonic and the evil. Yeah, Mary?
I know you said in the past that when we get into the creation aspect, the fabric out of which is created has deals with the trickster.
Mm-hmm.
So that's tying in with it.
Yeah. She's making a reference to the trickster issue in North American creation stories among the Native Americans, and the role of the trickster in the context of creation mythology. And I've given a number of lectures on that are available, but suffice to say that it's very usual in creations for there to be a non-conforming agent present. And, you know, you can think about how you would think about that issue, that being present at creation that's not entirely cooperative, not entirely obedient.
Is there evil in every cosmology? Is there no mythology that...
That would be an empirical question that I would not be prepared to make any kind of blanket statement on. Every mythology that I ever studied in any depth had a theory of of destructiveness, the origins of destructiveness. That doesn't mean there's not one somewhere that doesn't. I just haven't seen it. There might be some peoples that might not have any sense of that. But that, again, is an empirical, anthropological question. Anyway, so let's stay with this. So hierophany is manifestation of the holy. What we have to, of the sacred, what we have to be aware of is, according to these scholars, that whenever the sacred or the holy has been manifested, it has been a manifestation of power, creative power. Power so great that it risks humans' lives to be in touch with it. So in the various stories, there will be a sense that this power has a certain ambivalence about it. That is, it's not seen as friendly and always nice. That there is an ambivalence to this power in some deep sense. We've talked about how this power is experienced at a center. And we have to think about psychologically, now what is this tendency to experience power as being at a center and not diffuse? And you can think about all sorts of analogies to that sort of thing, electrical analogies and so forth. But that when you experience it, it is intense and concentrated. And then it rapidly moves out from the center. And that at a certain point there begins to be fragmentation. And that nice mandala, we ought to talk about mandalas. Some of you were talking about your work with mandalas. We ought to talk about that in this context. But power, center, creation, moving out in waves, turbulence, conflict, splitting, evil. And so this concept of splitting is one that you want to think about in the context of creation, because so many of the stories talk about the way splits form. You get to creation and then splits form. You had it harmonious at first and then lack of cooperation. Well, there are lots of different ways to think about these things psychologically, and I'm just going to present a few. Before our break this afternoon, I'm going to talk chiefly about Jung and self-psychology in the Cohoosian tradition. And then after the break, I'm going to say a little bit more about my way of thinking about this and how it would fit it in relationship to creation issues. It's very interesting the way in which Jungian psychology and contemporary Cohoosian psychoanalytic self-psychology tend to agree on the way in which human beings have to deal with enormously powerful inner energies, which are the source of great creativity and vision and the source of psychopathology, a lot of psychopathology. So one of the things we want to think about is the way in which creation myths talk about the rise of pathology and disorganization. Let me just start with Jung. Now, you've been studying this stuff for a while. How does inflation occur? What is inflation? Somebody give me a straightforward sort of classical Jungian take on that. How do you get inflated? You think you're the source of it. That's interesting. I'm identified with the center. See that? Does that ring any bells? Think about people who we think of as being inflated. They act as if they are the center of the world. Or at least they act as if we should think that they are the center of the world. This is what is known, we talk about it more later, in psychoanalytic theory of the transference and countertransference today. They talk about that as a sort of a mirror hunger. It's not a very felicitous way of thinking about it, but a mirror hunger. That is to say, if you have a lot of longings to be the center of attention, it's known as mirror hunger. If you haven't read Elson's book, Miriam Elson's book, Self-Psychology and Clinical Social Work, it's a good place to start. Elson, E-L-S-O-N, Self-Psychology and Clinical Social Work. It's a great introduction. And then look at Ernest Wolf's book. These are important books to get any sense for this perspective that I'm comparing and contrasting and using to interpret Jung's work. Ernest Wolf's book, Treating the Self. Very important synopsis of recent thought in that tradition. But there is this sense in that tradition that is very similar to Jung's view. That is, Jung believed that there is archetypal energy in us. A lot of people talk about these archetypes as functioning like almost like transformers. I don't think that's too good an image. It's more like they are the generators. They are the reactors. Much more like nuclear reactor cores. And the problem is having transformers. The problem is being able to understand, like most people, pre-modern peoples understood, that The world is full of dangerous energy. Not only is the world full of it, you're full of it. And what is even more dangerous is that when you feel like you're empty, that is when it's about to spill over. So if I don't remember to do anything else today this afternoon, remind me to talk more about this issue of defending against grandiosity. Because it is when we feel wooden and empty inside and that we have no gold energy, that is when our defenses are taxed to the utmost, and we're having trouble keeping ourselves in denial about this radiation from within. So that makes it harder, because then if you don't have anybody explaining the plumbing to you, you would think that there's no radiation in the room. Like walking into a reactor room not knowing anything about atomic energy, assuming because it's quiet in there, there's no danger. See? And it's very hard to push that analogy too far. That is, the analogy between atomic radiation and archetypal energy when it comes to self-psychology. The Cohoutians have given us many contributions, but one of the biggest, I think, is helping us to think much more carefully about grandiosity or archetypal energy. They spend a great deal of their time thinking a very minute microscopic level, the micro level, about the way grandiosity manifests. And for us to understand all this stuff, the psychology of all this fascination with the powers of creation, and why you have to have all this ritual to protect you from it, we need to think about that stuff with them. Somebody had their hand up back here. Yes?
I'm getting confused. You said when we feel we have no gold energy, is when the defenses are taxed, you feel empty, and that's when
it's about to overflow on you.
Dangerous energy, which has a negative connotation. And you talk about the gold energy, which has a positive connotation.
Well, that's right. They are the same energy. That's what I'm trying to get across. There's no such thing as archetypal energy that is not dangerous. In other words, by definition, from a Jungian point of view, if it's archetypal, it's numinous. That's why you can always, if somebody's talking about archetypes and they tell you something about, well, this is an archetype, and if we're talking Jungian, if it is not numinous, it's not an archetype. So if they say, well, what about the archetype of the milk can? Say, well, for some people, milk cans may be numinous, but not for enough people that is likely to be an archetype. I'm serious. I mean, I joke, but see, there are all these people running around don't know anything about archetypal psychology, and everything's archetypes. And they're welcome to talk any way they want, but not to call it Jungian, in my view. I mean, that is to say, if you're talking Jungian point of view, if it is archetypal, it's numinous. If it's numinous, it's loaded with energy that is not domesticated. If it is loaded with energy that is not domesticated, it's dangerous to the cohesiveness of the self. Do you follow that? Anybody doesn't follow that? Yes.
I follow, but what about like patterns, like universal patterns?
Yes.
You call that human? Isn't that so archetypal?
Well, the issue of whether the universal patterns are numinous or not is what you'd have to think about. Well, what do you mean the universal patterns are not numinous? For example, after the break, I'm going to talk about how the warrior pattern in you is numinous. And these different numinous, it means loaded with an energy that you will experience when you connect with it as magical and a bit overpowering. It is the experience of the holy. You read Rudolf Otto's book, Das Heilige, And you get this sense of the mysterium tremendum, mysterium fascinans. That is, the tremendous mystery and the tremendous fascination. It is such a tremendous mystery that I want to shield myself from it. It is so fascinating compulsively I want to run and touch it. And so it is ambivalent to me in its very essence, because I want to go touch it and I want to go hide. And it's all the same experience. And if you understand the phenomenology of the holy, as Otto talks about it, that's where Jung got his way of talking about the archetypes. He got it from Otto. Das Heilige. And they translated it into English, as you might guess, the idea of the holy. The actual translation is the holy. In other words, it's not an idea of anything. It is an experience, an earthquake. It's not the idea of an earthquake. You know, it's 8.5 on the Richter scale or something like that.
And it's dangerous if it's not domesticated.
You can't domesticate this energy. The only thing you can do is find ways to touch it which enable you to touch it in a way that it does not overstimulate you to the point that you cannot function anymore. Now, that's one of the words I should have put up here, did I? No, I should have put overstimulation in here. Big issue. Overstimulation. Why is that an issue? Powerful, overwhelming energy, creative energy. It's like a solar furnace. It's like a nuclear reactor. It's like the heart of the sun. So if you get close to it, it's going to overstimulate you. What's going to happen then? You're going to have a trouble maintaining your cohesiveness. This is what happens. Now, one of the things you want to do, I don't have to ask, do you ever get overstimulated? I know you all get overstimulated. The question is, how do you get overstimulated? And one of the things you ought to take as a psychological project is asking yourself, by just scanning your life, now when do I get overstimulated and how? And we'll look at that some this afternoon. That is to say, simple questions like, when do I find it impossible to concentrate? When do I get easily distracted? When I'm sitting down to write or at my PC, when is it that I have to get up after 5 minutes? Go do something practical, see, that I have to do, of course. Or get up and go to the bathroom. Even an aging male like some of us here do not have to go to the bathroom as often as we have to go to the bathroom. Even with bladder problems, you don't have to get up that often. That's a nice rationalization for why we can't sit still. See? You ought to understand the capacity to sit still and concentrate is an enormous achievement. Think about it. And just think about how capable are you of sitting still and concentrating on something for more than a few minutes. Because if you're not able to, the fires are burning real close. And they're creative fires. And we have what we call in Jungian terms, we'd say there's an ego-self-axis problem here. We haven't got this tuned up right. I'm flying a little too close to the sun or a little too far from the sun, depending. Or we'd say, in self-psychology terms, I'm not modulating my grandiosity well. I'm not I have not learned adequate self-soothing techniques to respond to my overstimulation. I have not learned to sit, when I sit down at the typewriter, I have not learned to close my eyes and meditate and get centered for a few minutes before I start. Okay? Why does it matter how I start? Well, do creation myths have anything to say about that? It matters how you start. The research shows that the first 4 minutes of anything you do are very determinative. Yes?
What goes on when you meditate? I mean, say in a Buddhist meditation, you sit an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. What happens after
What happens?
that?
Well, what happens when you meditate, the unfortunate thing is that it depends on what kind of meditation. Because there are meditations that overstimulate you. And there are forms of meditation that do relax you. So if you look at something like Benson's book, The Relaxation Response, you get an overview of the physiology of meditation, which helps to relax. But see, what a lot of spiritual persons do not seem to realize is that some meditations are very overstimulating. And you can meditate and meditate and meditate, and you can get very close to thinking you're the Buddha. And that begins to be very disorganizing. And there are people that meditate to the point that they become totally dysfunctional in life. And since they don't understand the way in which meditation can radically overstimulate you, and what I'll do after the break is show you, I think that meditation can easily overstimulate you in this magician's space. And if it overstimulates you and you get grandiose in a magician way, you're going to detach. And so one of the things we'll talk about is how your energies of creation can get out of whack in not one but 4 different ways, in my view.
How do you relate
Yes.
to the Greek concept of creativity being a sort of possession, the muses?
Well, he's raising the issue of the Greek idea of creativity being related to the muses or possession. It's also related to the Greek idea of hubris and the danger of creativity, danger of being creative. And so you just did the relationship. That is clearly related to what they were talking about there, and that is to say, if you study cross-cultural creativity cross-culturally, one of the interesting things that you find is that human beings have always understood its ambivalence. And they've always understood that right with creation comes evil. And if you study the different stories, the stories are amazingly similar. I've lectured on this in these lectures on the psychology of Satan, which I gave for the Institute not long ago, in which you see the way in which the energies of creativity quickly turn into disorganizing energies and dysfunctional energies. That is, energies which cause you to fragment and start acting out in destructive ways which destroy you and other people. And they've all understood this. It's fascinating. And that's why they're scared about this. I mean, human beings, you know, the concept of taboo did not arise willy-nilly. I mean, the idea of taboo is directly related to this. Ritual uncleanness. And the more creative you are as a person in most of these early traditions, the more taboo you're likely to be. And menstrual blood is directly related to this. You cannot understand the prohibitions about menstrual blood in human history and ritual uncleanness of women if you don't understand this. It has absolutely nothing to do with personal hygiene. Nothing whatsoever to do with cleanliness in modern sense. It has everything to do with power, creativity. And women are taboo because they are so dangerous. Why are they dangerous? because they are closer to the forces of creation than males. Where would anybody get the idea that women are closer to the forces of creation than males? Childbirth. Childbirth. Males have noticed that the forces of creation come in and take women, and against the will of the woman, bring forth a child. Even if the woman does not want to bring it forth, this thing called power of creativity will bring it forth. Yes?
Well, you're talking about, along with creativity, doesn't also bring sort of something concrete and structure? You know, I think about, like, in my work with, like, making something, you are sort of making a symbol of maybe that power, so you're giving it sort of its boundaries. So
sure.
It has a contrast from a sense of just being dangerous,
yes,
or
but you have,
unorganized or ambiguous.
Yes, but you have to look at the ancient experience of birth process. And you have to remember that ancient peoples didn't see birth in hospitals where things were contained and so forth, and they also were experiencing births of other animals a lot.
Well, I'm not necessarily thinking of just the birth of humans, but the creation of the making of something.
Oh, yes.
Other than birth. I mean, I think they're really connected.
Oh, yes, no question about it. But you see, what you got to get a sense for is the fear. Now, I don't think that there's a sense in which I think that females have been less frightened about this than males. But you also got to put this, you need to read, say, for example, Mary Douglas's book, Purity and Danger. And it's an anthropological study of taboos. And get a sense for the way in which peoples, at the time we were talking about these mythological traditions, they were very aware and frightened by any birth of any kind of animal that was not perfect. Because they knew the created order in illo tempore was perfect. And when monsters were born, it was a terrifying experience for them. And so this whole thing about taboo, taboo, according to Douglas, is raised when something comes that's not in its clear form. Then everything is contaminated with this energy. In other words, your insulation is gone. If there's a monster born, the insulation that protects you from this creative process may be goofed up. It would be like if you, it's very much like Chernobyl. It's like, oh my God, there's been a radiation leak. And there's going to be a lot more monsters coming. Yeah, Mary.
You got me thinking about something. Now, you talked about the menstrual cycle of a woman. The male is able to bring forth, whether she wants to or not, he could bring forth creation. What about a woman or women?
No, the woman was bringing forth creation. The man was scared to death by this process. Yeah.
What about a woman who didn't fall into that cycle? How would that be viewed?
There was a tendency in ancient cultures for a woman that did not have a child to be seen as defective.
Okay. The reason I'm getting to this is because I had brought this up Friday afternoon, and I felt that there was something here that nobody was catching on. And it dealt with women and their fertility cycles and their weight. And it talked about if their body fat is less than 91% or something like that, that they not only would lose their cycle, like ballet dancers, athletes and stuff. I mean, they just wouldn't have their period at all. And I was wondering how the ancient males, how they would view that as being, gosh, she is going through this cycle. What's wrong with her?
It's interesting. Think about it that way. You're saying, what about men's attitude toward women who get so much into an Amazon position, or a warrior position, I would call it, that they don't reproduce. And I think in these ancient cultures, very often males were very suspicious of that, repressive of that. I wouldn't say that's universal, but see, it's important for you to keep the frame now. If you're going to study this stuff, keep framing all of this discussion with creative powers. Because if you're not framing it with creative powers and the fear and fascination of creative powers and not knowing how to relate to them and having to develop all of your ritual systems to help you relate to it. All of these systems of ritual were developed to help human beings relate in a helpful way to these things. Yes, back here.
You know, speaking of menstrual blood and power.
Yes.
When we're going to have like Indian pipe ceremonies, it's very difficult to get across to the Anglo women that they must not be present at the time of their menstrual period because, not of uncleanliness, because at that time the Indian believes they have so much power that they can drain off the male element there, so they are...
That's classical male problems.
But it's also hard for the women who are feminists.
Right, of course. I mean, but you see, if you don't have any understanding of the mythological context, there's no way to understand what that's about. And I mean, you're putting your finger on something there. See, I see the great problem with males, and always has been and is today and always will be, feeling strong enough to deal with the female gender. And if one does not understand that, then there's no chance to understand the difficulty with the relationships between the sexes, because men have to be very, very strongly consolidated in some sense of self-esteem to be able to cope with powerful femininity, and that's just a problem. It's, you know, and the question is, can that be dealt with? I think it can be constructively dealt with, but this is an issue that's a big one. But you got to put it in this. You got to put this in the context of the psychology of these energies. Yes, back here.
Well, I was thinking about the whole paradox of when there's creation, there's inherent evil that comes right into the picture. And it seems to me it has something to do with existence and non-existence. For example, when the body is created, inherently life is created, but also the death of that body is immediately present to and needs to be attended to. So that there is some way in which the whole question of temporality arises again. How long is this creation? And notions of immortality as ways of dealing with the needing to cease creation.
Yes, and let me just repeat this bit for the tape. She's saying that in these contexts, they always kept together the idea of creation and death. They did not lose track of that. When creation comes, dissolution will come. This would be true of every mythological system I know about. And what we need to ask is, what happens when human beings lose the capacity to have a myth, their living myth, the one they live out, one that includes dying, that is, say, finitude.
And even the finitude of the self.
Well, this is precisely, she says, even the finitude of the self. This is precisely the issue with regard to modulating your grandiosity. For example, if your grandiose energies are really strong and not very modulated, you will almost never think in any kind of concentrated, careful way about your mortality. You will tend to live as if you can't be harmed. You will tend to take unnecessary risk. For example, if you want to see this, you know this, what's the name of this? Point Break. Go see the movie Point Break. What's that, Patrick Swayze or something? There's a portrayal of a bunch of young men who are shooting up with adrenaline all the time. And they're surfers. And they're skydivers. And they're bank robbers. And they rob banks in order to have enough money to follow the surf around the world where it's good. And what the portrayal is really about is about persons whose grandiosity is so unmodulated that they cannot really get dying clearly in their mind. They can get the thrill part of the risk, but the idea that one of my friends would actually die from what we're doing is not a part of my awareness. We're charmed. And those police don't shoot real bullets. Or if they do shoot real bullets, they won't hit us. See? Or if they do hit us, we'll live through it. I mean, it's a very interesting study. I mean, it's not as shallow a movie as you might think on first glance if you think in terms of narcissistic energies, because there are loads of people, male and female, who take too many unnecessary chances. And in driving, in sports, and all sorts of things, and it's based on their grandiosity, their unmodulated grandiosity, because your unmodulated grandiosity is not going to die. It is sure it's not going to die. It doesn't even need checkups. I'm serious, you know, and you can ask yourself, when was your last checkup? If you're a woman, when was your last breast exam? Or when was your last pap smear? And if it is not within a reasonable amount of time, you have to say, there's my grandiosity. Because, you see, I'm not going to get cancer. See? Or people who do not exercise. People who do not watch their diets. It's grandiosity based, because, you see, when my great self is running me, I'm never going to die. And you see, this is the way the self-psychologist operates. See, there are much Jungians, you know, there are a lot of Jungians you can talk to, and they'll use the word inflation, but a lot of them wouldn't know it if it hit them in the face. Except in some very blatant way about somebody coming on and walking very arrogantly in and presenting and blah, 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 doing what I'm doing. They'd see that as arrogant, inflated. But a lot of them don't understand the micro-level phenomenology of inflation, and it is real simple and it's real scary when you get into it, because the self-psychologists have gotten down to where they can look at ordinary everyday life and show you the way this inflation really cashes out in these ways. Yes, go ahead.
Can you talk about these issues in terms of the Judeo-Christian story of that we know as Genesis 3, the encounter of Adam and Eve with God after they've eaten the apple?
Mm-hmm. I'm sure, I mean, raising the issue of the Genesis stories, I'm sure that if you were to think about the creation story in the Judeo-Christian tradition out of this kind of point of view, there would be a lot of interesting things that you would come to, like that particular issue, but there are others. I mean, you can think about this idea of being in a space in this garden, and you can think about the grandiosity of not assuming somebody might suggest that you do something that is evil. Now see, that is grandiosity. And that is the grandiosity of the naive person. Every naive person is incredibly grandiose. Because in their credulity, they are assuming I am invulnerable. And so there are all sorts of things you could do with that story, and it'd be interesting to see if there's some really bright people that are interested in the scriptures at the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute that may start doing some of these things. Yeah.
I was thinking about the whole matter of taboo and their eating of this fruit that
Yes.
brings them
Yes.
close to the whole.
Yes. Well, you can also think about the limit. You see, the king image there. God as the king image says, now there are limits here. You can have all this stuff, there's plenty, but you don't do this. So there's this limit. Narcissism in pathological grandiosity, see, in fact, all forms of gold and grandiose energies hate limits. The great self in all of us cannot stand limits. It really does not like it. It never will like it. Don't wait till you've had enough analysis till you get to where you like it. That part always hates limits. And so the very idea to say, now there's this limit here. The grandiose organization doesn't want to hear that. And it wants to hear that there are no limits. For example, this whole thing, the idea that the human species should have no limit on reproduction, which many people push today, supposedly responsible people, supposedly moral people, supposedly spiritual people. It is a massive, massive grandiosity, hubris, human hubris, not to limit creativity. In fact, the meaning of the Sabbath day, I'm convinced, in the creation thing, is that even God limits. That even the creator of the universe does not create in an unlimited way. And I think that for an Orthodox Jew who wears this symbolic cap, this is an acknowledgement of the truth about the true God, that even God limits, therefore my creation and pride will be limited. And I will not be ashamed to stand before anyone with the symbol of my being limited before the true God. And if they seek to shame me, they are simply showing their own arrogance. See, you follow? See? So, and circumcision in Judaism, I believe, is of the same symbolic system, that the circumcision of the male organ of generation is the same thing as the Sabbath mythology. You follow that? It's the limit on creativity. And this is the issue here. And what I'm trying to get us to see is this creative energy is so intoxicating that when you touch it, you don't want to get your hand off of it. You see, and it quickly becomes compulsive. Yes, Jude.
I just wanted to mention some few cultures that don't regard aberrances of nature as demonic, like the Indian tribes that make the hermaphrodites the shamans or sages. There are some few cultures
that don't make them what?
That don't demonize the aberrances.
Well, they demonize them, though. That is, they have special power. That's why they become shamans.
Right.
They're not ordinary.
Right.
See.
But it's nice not to express fear, but admiration.
No, but it's not just admiration. If you have a shaman in your tribe, you're not going to call him old brother Bill the shaman. You're scared of that man because he's in touch with powers that you believe could kill you at the drop of a hat. So we got to understand that they have a place for it. See, the important point, I think, about what Julia is saying is they know what to do with this. They don't freak out. They say, oh, I know what this is. This is a blah, 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 blah. And they're for this. So we put this particular social role, which has what? Containment. Think about that's a big one. Containment of creative energy. So they've got a ritual form and a social role, which contains this person's mana, their power, their charisma. Yes?
You talked about that movie. There's another one, Switch, which shows the opposite. A man coming back in the form of a woman and giving birth to a child.
Mm.
It's also facing death. So there is some movement in our society.
In the consciousness about these issues. It's interesting. I'm forever fascinated with popular culture and the way in which it kind of mirrors what we're doing. And so.
Oh, go see it. It's in there.
Jody, isn't that Jodie Foster? And then who? Elaine Barkin. Barkin. Yeah, I remember seeing the trailers on that. Yeah. But anyway, it is interesting to see us metabolizing this stuff. But you know, the real impact of Hollywood a lot. See, if you've got to understand the role of cinema in our culture and increasingly around the world. You have to understand that our experience of cinema is a ritual process. And we are relating to grandiosity and projection through the cinema. And so you have to see the way in which the adulation of Madonna, for example. And, well, I can just say if you look at the way in which, if you are not comfortable with your grandiosity, you will tend to experience it in projected form on someone else that you idealize, and then you will hate them. I mean, there's a lot of people that will go to see everything Madonna does and then talks about her negatively. See? And now that's a typical way that one relates to anyone that one idealizes. You see, we idealize the person and then we attack them because we hate anybody that we're giving our grandiosity to. Do you follow it? In other words, if I have to give my grandiosity to you, I hate you for it because I want it. See? And if you're a leader in any kind of form, you have this with your followers. Because to the extent that they give you their grandiosity and you don't quickly try to give it back, then they will be trying to set up an assassination attempt in some way.
But couldn't the opposite happen, that you're ashamed of your grandiosity, and you project it, and worship somebody else?
But that's why you project it.
Yeah.
The shame issue, we were talking about this, John and I were talking about the shame issue some at lunch. It's like you have to understand the plumbing of shame. And shame issues are related to this creative energy that's within you that nobody ever helped you relate to in a very positive way. And so to the extent that you haven't found a way to relate in a constructive way to the gold energy, you will have a lot of shame that will make it necessary for you to give it away to somebody else. Yeah. So that's a good insight, I think. Yes, John.
I'd like to extend this analogy in ways which I think hook up this discussion. And that is that, in a sense, the archetypes are the dynamo or the nuclear reactor. And if I plug my toaster in, it's going to explode directly. And what the transformer is well, myth and ritual are in some sense ways that we, and maybe meditation, we step down this archetypal energy so that now I can plug into it without getting my ass fried and draw something from it. I thought that was really good, that what we're discussing about mythology, in my mind, it functions in this way.
That's important. John is saying that that myth and ritual then can be seen as serving as transformers. I think that's absolutely right. That's what they always did for the human species until we got smart with modernity and learned how to have addictions. You know, we learned how to be chronically depressed and to be addicted in great droves, and I don't know if that's a great improvement over mythology. People that taught me demythologization back in the 60s thought it was. But this is one of the things that I said to the conference at Oasis on the importance of Joseph Campbell's work. And that is that I believe, as John has said, that you cannot get away from the mythological imagination in a healthy way. What we have to do is to create new ways to get beyond being trapped in tribal mythologies, because that's a great danger, always has been a great danger. When your tribe confronts the other tribe and you both think yours is the only myth, then you have the Nazi phenomenon. You have the racism of Japan, which fed into the beginning of the Second World War. Or you have all of the other tribal myths which serve as rationalizations for oppression of other peoples. So the challenge today is to find a post-tribal planetary way to value mythology, to live in a mythic imagination which does not depreciate other perspectives. I think that's not only possible, I think people are doing it today, and we've just got to try to help them with it. But the issue is, why do you need myth to continue? Well, let me give you an example of the way. In fact, let me give you a reference on a book which talks about this. There's a book edited by Lawrence Sullivan entitled Healing and Restoring, and it's about comparative perspectives on healing from different cultures. In there, he talks in one place about Polynesian tradition, in which when a man needed to have a lot of strong, some would say heroic energy, or I would say warrior energy to confront a task, not only would he relate to the mythic figure, he would become the mythic figure for that particular purpose for a limited amount of time. In other words, if he was going out to hunt the shark for a certain purpose for the tribe in the canoe, he would remember the way this ancestor did it in the creation story about the way that his people were found. And he would take on the persona of that ancestor who did that task for the tribe then, so that he would be empowered enough to do that for the tribe now. Very sophisticated kind of technique, contained with ritual, contained with an understanding of how long you do this, what time. And the people had this understanding of how to help him up into that and how to help him down out of that when he came back, you see. So that's an example. The peoples of the world understood much better about how you get into this energy and how you get out of it than we do. But we've got to rediscover it. Otherwise, we're going to be chronically depressed all the time, or addicts all the time. The positive purpose of the trickster is to deflate you or somebody else when you're getting dangerously inflated. If the trickster part of the psyche is operating and doing its job, that's what it will be doing. The problem is, it does not like any order. And if it is not in context, it will become very inflated and a giant itself. See? There is no right order in the trickster. See? And so, you know, it has a positive role, but when it gets too much energy, then it starts being a loose cannon and doing all sorts of things. So the trickster stuff is fascinating just in that respect. It has its role in modulating things, but you know, you can get, for example, a person whose trickster is real inflated, and one's grandiosity comes out in the trickster, it's very interesting. They become hypercritical. And they criticize everything mercilessly, so that nothing can really be created or valued. It's fascinating. So it has a role in creation, but if it gets too much energy, deconstruction happens. And a lot of the trickster stories in North America are the way in which the trickster gets himself in trouble. You know, he's always in some kind of trouble. A couple of more comments and questions, and then let's take a short break. Yeah.
You notice in some of these creation myths that the animal becomes human, the human becomes animal, you know, just in a sentence or two.
Yes.
In Africa, visiting, and I think it's a Nui or Noi or something like this, but they have a ritual procedure where the people will dress up like an animal, you know, we were taking him the feathers and the birds, like a bird, and one of them was accidentally killed, you know, in the dark of the night by a car. They didn't see him. But there were no charges brought against the driver because at the time he was killed, he was not a man, he was that animal. Yes. I mean, they believe it so intensely.
Yes. Now look at, see, you've raised this whole thing. One of the things that that you need to think about in this context is the role of celebration in all these, among these peoples. Victor Turner's work before his untimely death did enormous amounts of things with regard to celebration. And you need to think about this ritualized celebration like Mardi Gras and other things in the context of what we're talking about today. Because if you are a people that understands about all this creative energy, and if you're pretty sophisticated ritually, then you're going to make ritualized occasions possible for people to get into that energy and feel it without being shamed for it near as much. What you will notice is these tribal peoples had a lot of occasions in which they could dress up and be shameless. I mean, one of the things you ought to do, if you haven't been to the Field Museum lately, go down to the Field Museum and go through those exhibits and look at all the permission to dress up that people had. And people in the very isolated areas in the world today still have that permission. I was up in the highlands of Borneo with the Sea Dayak headhunters, and I was stricken with this capacity for both the females of the tribe and the males of the tribe to, under ritualized occasions, put on the most, what a lot of folks would think was outrageous finery. You know, loads of gold coins so heavy that that you know you could hardly walk with them, and dance with all this gold, dance with all these beautiful dyed feathers and so forth, and have everybody enjoying your flamboyant exhibitionism. See? And it's one of the things we need to look at, see, because if you understand that that's there and must be included in human experience in ways that don't make everybody crazy, then you ritualize it. But if you stop doing that, then you start shaming people for being exhibitionistic, then you make them crazy, because people are going to find ways to be exhibitionistic in some way, often very self-destructive. It's 3:10. Let's take a short break and come back in about 10 minutes, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the different inflations. I just wanted to have us continue this thinking about creativity, grandiosity, the arising of fragmentation and splitting, and the appearance of evil in human experience, in the context of my recent work, in which I'm attempted to continue Jung's understanding of the collective unconscious and the objective psyche, and to do further work on understanding its structure. I have talked to many of you about this before. You might just look at this mandala on this Man and His Symbols book. If you study Jung's work, you'll find his preoccupation with the way in which creation has been associated with quaternios, with fourfold patterns. I lectured to some of you about this earlier last week. And a series of books have been presenting this, and there are a number of others that will be forthcoming elaborating it. But in short, I think that if we look at this picture here, what you're seeing is an image of the self, of the structure of the deep self, the blueprint for the self. And that's fairly Jungian, and the idea of a mandala being an image of the self is pretty much centrist Jungian. The elaboration in my thought that goes beyond Jung, I believe, is that I believe that the four quarters are clearly these four powers. That is to say that there are four powers in human psychology in both men and women. They get expressed in these expressed by these different archetypal images, these mythical images. The implications of this, if I'm right, are enormous for all of these issues we're talking about today, because one of the implications is that you're not grandiose in only one way. That is, there are many ways to be grandiose, and the Cohoutians have not talked in a very careful way about the varieties of these in a structural way. Although I must say that Ernest Wolf's work is actually very close to the work that I've been doing in the way in which he describes different self-needs and different, as he puts it, self-object needs in a list of the different ways in which the needs of the self, if it is to be whole and developed, in other words, if a world is to be created, include, as he puts it, let me get this thing, include, I'll point to these. He talks about the need for merger experiences. That's lover. I would call that lover experience, or the lover space. He talks about the need for efficacy and the capacity to be adversarial as a need of the self. If you have a developed self, you have that. That would be the warrior in my understanding. Excuse me? Whether it's male or female, everyone has the need to be capable of being effective, and everyone has the need to be able to take a stand and form boundaries and protect the boundaries effectively. And that's what they talk about as adversarial. It's much more complicated than that, but look at Wolf's book to get an elaboration of it. And they talk about the need for mirroring and idealization. I put that in the context of king or queen. That is, when you're talking about having someone you can idealize adequately, that's really, in my view, that would be a king or queen idealizing transference. And when they talk about the defense against an idealizing transference, I would say that's the magician that they're talking about, because the magician in you does not want to idealize anybody. It sees through them. It's the trickster function, but it's also the magician function, and the magician in you will always see through anybody's theory. And so universities are not really universities. They can't be universities, because the university is about seeing through every theory, coming up with another theory so that you can see through that theory. And so the magician is what the self-psychologist would call it's sort of the ground for that defense against idealization, but it is also a in my view, a program, a biogram in the psyche, which has to do with cognitive functions in general: reflection, contemplation, and all of the things that we associate with that. So we'd put, the self-psychologists haven't done enough with this yet. They will do more with this, I'm sure, in the future as they elaborate into a general psychology, but we'd put Piaget here, and all the theorists of cognitive development would be in that magician sector. So this is my argument, and as I've said often, if you look at the work of Theodore Milan and others, there's enormous empirical evidence that supports this, as well as other kinds of disciplines. But for our purposes today, I want to just suggest to you that you look at the way in which images of the city, which are always in mythological systems, images of the world, polis reflects cosmos in mythical traditions. And so if you look at an ancient city, it is a model of the world. It's a model of the mythical world. And so if you study ancient cities, you'll see that they're quadrated. And if you look at that image over there on the book again, I don't know whether you saw the Tibetan monks doing the map of Shambhala at the Field Museum of Natural History recently with a sand painting. But in my view, the Tibetan work on the mythical city of Shambhala is an image, a projected image of the deep structures of the self. I think these are the powers in the deep structures of the self. And so if we look at that and we take the issue that it's very hard to keep these things regulated and balanced with each other. You see the centrifugal forces in the deep self. Creation myths talk about how hard it is once you create a world to keep it from splitting. See? So my suggestion would be that the four quarters of the quadrated world that you see in mythological systems and in mythological tales of creation reflect the four tensions, the two tension arcs that exist. Kohut says there's one tension arc in the self. He says it's between ambitions, which I associate with king and queen, and ideals, which I associate with the magician. And I say, yes, Kohut's absolutely right. There is a tension arc between ambitions and ideals, between those two sectors of the self. But you know, Freud thought there was a tension between eros and aggression. So I say, Freud was right. There's a tension arc also between eros and aggression. So the early Kohut I would be more comfortable with, the one that believed that there's not really a conflict necessarily between looking at narcissistic libido and looking at sexual and aggressive libido. That is to say that these, if you look at this model of the self, you can hold Freud and Kohut together without seeing them as being conflictual with each other. But the implications of this are that when creation occurs, these energies are very powerful. The self is experiencing all of these powerful energies. It's very easy for it to split, and for there not to be a cohesiveness maintained in the self. My suggestion is that these mythical stories of this breaking, this presentation of the world as being enforced, and a lot of the traditional mythical psychologies talk about what happens when you get too much earth, or too much air, or too much fire, or too much water. And the Navajo mythologies talk about there being four winds that you've got to balance. And if you're going to be sane, the four winds in your psyche are going to have to be balanced in some way, or there's going to be mental illness. I think that those are mythical elaborations of these tensions in the self. And that if you split, and if the great energies of creation and the self in you split yourself, you will not split in a balanced way. you will tend to get grandiose in one or two of these areas, and you will tend to be on one or the other of the poles here. And in this book, we talk about the bipolar shadow here. You can declare bankruptcy, or you can be a tyrant, see. You can be a sadist, or you can be a masochist, see. But so the issue that I think is important to look at when they show us these structures of these ancient cities as mythical images, I think we need to understand that that's very likely a model of the self, and that when you're thinking about what happens when the self is not maintained in balance, that you ask yourself, where does the grandiosity go? Where does the energy flow? Into what circuitry does it flow? Because depending on what circuitry that great energy of the self flows into, the splitting that happens to your soul will be expressed in a certain way. And so if you get inflated in a magician way, there are only so many ways that's going to manifest. You're undoubtedly going to detach. But you can either become the great dummy or the great know-it-all. And either is a magician inflation. The person that says, I just don't understand any of this stuff, is in a magician inflation. It's a negative magician inflation. It's wonderful if you don't want to do anything. The Adlerians, I didn't think that up. The Adlerians are the ones that are wonderful at this. If you come on and act dumb with an Adlerian therapist, they're going to give you a knowing grin. Yes, Your Majesty, we know you do not want to wash the dishes. It's like if you were to ask yourself, where is there's a certain kind of embodiment all in here. And if you think of the diamond body that the Buddhists talk about, full embodiment would really be an expression of that octahedral shape. And so there's a tension between embodiment and spiritual illumination that's built into that. There's no question about that, yes.
Here, a lot of times it's because visualizes the step pyramid and you have circumambulating around. But with the step pyramid, I can never imagine a way of how to get from one step to another.
Yes.
But what if it was a labyrinth that was around there? Labyrinths
Yes.
have doorways and passage,
That's right.
spiraling around it.
Spirals, yes.
And how does, if, for example, you're in one mode here, and I got to bed at base, we're into the shadow material, but being, say, the magician, does that always constellate? Or will that constellate king in some form or another? Or how does it in some way access that shadow material over there besides its own shadow material?
Good question. It's a sophisticated question. What she's asking about is the way this works out actually in psychopathology in terms of what happens depending on where you have your energy focus and how do you develop and individuate. This gets back to the issue of the question of restoration and individuation and all that sort of thing. She's also suggesting what I think is a very important idea, and that is development is almost always in these traditions seen as circumambulation. That is, going around and around, and she's suggesting the spiral image of development, which is, of course, one that's widely accepted in mythological traditions. Mazes, spirals, the idea of climbing up this way. In fact, you find many different traditions in which this is the case. One of the things that you can do is you travel to places like Borobudur, which are Borobudur in Java. Go there and spend a little time on the self, because Borobudur is an image, in my view, of the self. And so what you do is you go around that place and you see what is possible to do on that thing. And what you do is you find that, just as you say, you can climb Borobudur by going up a gate, and then you walk around, and then you come back and you can go up then another gate, and then you come back and you walk around, and then you come up and you go up another. And so Borobudur, it's this great Buddhist monument in Java. It's just magnificent. And it's one of the great wonders of the world to be able to climb on that thing, walk around on it. And yet it's not, there are many, many images of this. If you go to Chartres Cathedral and you move the chairs back, on the floor is a maze, which has you moving like this through to the center. And there are many, many others of these. There are a couple of ways you can look at this. It's important to understand that you can't go to full development on one pole without getting crazy before you get there, because the other will be constellated in the unconscious. What did Jung call that? Enantiodromia. In other words, you're going to develop your lover. Well, you're going to get to the point where you're going to get very addictive, very incapable of monitoring boundaries at all. Then you're going to get invaded and abused. And then at a certain point, there's going to be this terminator from the unconscious that's going to come. And he's going to, like Terminator 2, you know. He's going to have a pump shotgun that he's going to twirl like a 6-gun. And he will attack those people that have hurt you. And of course, you'll be very ashamed of it after you attack them. But that's going to come out somewhere. Or you'll get somebody else to act this out for you. That's a sadomasochistic arrangement. Do what?
You hire a lawyer.
You hire a lawyer. That's a good one. But anyway, so there are many representations of this. Earlier this week, I talked about the way the Chinese palace of the emperor was in 4 quarters, and during the year, according to the astrological cycle, he would live in each quarter, and so he would act this thing out. But another image is of the Yoruba tradition of having a chief in each quarter, and that's a little bit more honest. That is to say, you really need 4 highly developed figures cooperating in your psyche, because they really can't be reduced, and you can't just live 1/4 of the year in one, you know, because the others will be very jealous while you are not with them. And so you got to ask yourself what is going on when you're not consciously attending to one of these spaces. And the rule is that if you don't think you're attending to it consciously, that means that your unconscious is attending to it behind your back, and you don't know what it's doing, but you can be sure it's getting energy somewhere. Yes?
Isn't this very like, how does it relate to Jung's 4 aspects of the personality? Logos, feeling, intuition.
Well, you know, that remains to be seen. The issue, he's raising the question of how this quadrated self relates to Jung's 4 functions. Some people tell me they can figure out that it relates. I say that there are 2, sensation and feeling is here, intuition and thinking is here, and these 2 are not really talked about by Jung. I think he let Freud take the father, the king issues and the warrior issues when he split up with Freud, you see. Jung never worked out his father issues. He never worked out his own kingship. He could never deal with his own shame about wanting an institute. So he told everybody he didn't want an institute, and he didn't want any followers. Now Freud You know, he intended to run it. He wasn't embarrassed to want to be the king. You know, his heroes were king warriors, you know, Freud's heroes. Hannibal, you know, conqueror. He wasn't ashamed of wanting to be a world conqueror. Freud was. Jung did not get that handled very well. He had a lot of shadow king elements in his personality. And so I would say to most Jungians, no, our great self-object Jung did not have his individuation worked out too well on these issues. But that's all right, none of the rest of us do either. But we need to see that split. The split between Jung and Freud is an archetypal split. And it continues in the Jungian movement today. I get a lot of grief about putting too much emphasis on king and warrior energy. I'm told I put too much emphasis on that. I find that interesting. I put too much emphasis on this, you see. I'm told by Jungians that's too extroverted. Well, as compared to what? I don't put too much emphasis on that. There's a place in this for introversion and extroversion, for passivity and activity, so forth and so on, see. But to put, see, if you've got all that extroversion in the shadow, then anybody that puts it into the model of the self and values it's going to be seen as putting too much emphasis on extroversion. See? So anyway, we've got an archetypal split, and this archetypal split exists in spiritual traditions. Not just Christian, I might add. There are a lot of spiritual traditions that are inflated in the magician, tremendously inflated in the magician. Those traditions that believe you can meditate the world into a harmony are in a magician inflation.
Don't you see, therefore, that the thing that's been worrying me all afternoon is grandiosity, which I had always thought was of the devil, so to speak.
Yes, well, certainly. He certainly has a lot of that, right?
Yeah, but you're sort of permitting it to be grandiose.
Yes, sir.
But so
honestly, grandiose.
Am I right in thinking that grandiosity is dangerous when it doesn't have the balance of your form?
That would be true. The other thing is related to this individuation issue that she raised earlier, and that is to say we've got to look. Now here's another issue that Jungians get into. Does the self regulate itself or not? They say the self has this self-regulation thing goes on. I say yes and no. The self regulates itself in this way. If you get too much of this, it's going to constellate this. If you get too much of this, it's going to constellate this, and so forth. So there is a self-regulation built into the wholeness of the self. Right. But what about when your ego is trying to swallow this thing and make it all you? Is there anything in the self that really keeps you from being consumed by all of this? Say that, you know, the whole thing's trying to land in you, huh? Is there anything that automatically prevents that? In my view, absolutely not. And you know who else thought that was no built-in protection? Jung himself thought there's no built-in protection from you from the inflation of the self. There's a moral responsibility that your ego, your I, has to take a stand and create a relationship to this. An ego self-axis. So there is do you understand this, what I'm saying? Do you understand how it regulates? There is a regulation. But you are not protected from, you know, did you ever see Close Encounters of the Third Kind? You know that big spaceship that comes up at the end? You know, it's sort of a great heavenly city, right? It's sort of the image of the self. It kind of arrives. Well, there's nothing that keeps this thing from landing on you, you know, in toto. And that is psychosis, and that is what frightens us all into feeling that we're nothing. See, when we look up, get that movie out again, look at it. When that thing appears, whoa. See, when it appears here and threatens to land, that's about the time we decide, oh, there's no such thing as UFOs. I would rather just be depressed. You know? I would rather just live in this world that's totally boring and be chronically depressed and get drunk once in a while and think there's a little UFO that flits by, you know. But it is my awareness of this humongous mother-fathership here that makes me deny, in my defense against the great self, that it exists. See? Now that they have a whole literature on defense against grandiosity, and denial is the first one. No, there's not any grandiosity here. See? So this is the bad news. There's no automatic mechanism that protects you from the mother-fathership landing on you.
That's a creation myth in reverse when you're pushing this guy out.
And you read, now see, it is not necessarily, he says that's a creation myth in reverse, you're trying to push the sky up. But let me suggest to you, and this is a good place for us to start drawing to a close, that there are many creation myths. There are many creation myths which have pushing the sky up as a part of the creation myth. In fact, there are many of them that have mother pushing and father pushing, so there's space to live in there. So I think it really, if you look at these myths, they pick up on this issue you're pointing out. There's something about having to push and make space that shows our role. Yeah.
That kind of ties into what I was just thinking. We're talking about the shadow on the corners, and as you get to the top, you said if you're one-sided and get up to the top, you fall into another thing. It's like if the grandiose self is sitting up at that peak, burning things, and if you get out that space apart, there's a temperate zone in there that you can sort of live within that cycle. If you're too far down into the chaos region, the shadow region, or if you get too close up there, you're going to get swallowed up and burned up.
Yeah, it's all, you can follow what you're saying. She's talking about the different ways, different locations in this space that you can be in trouble. But you can also think about this is where, right up here at the top of this pyramid, this is where the great sacred queen who rules her four quarters lives. In mythology, you know, that's where the Mayan king, this is where the Mayan king stands, who integrates these things. So in other words, you've got the king facet, but then you have the person who's attained this. This is where the great Lord of the four quarters stands. Okay, now then look at what patriarchy. Patriarchy exists when the Lord of the four quarters here, the male one, doesn't notice that over on the other side is an other who is not to be ruled and who is not under his rule. And she, and in my view, it's no easier for her to figure this out than it is for him. That across over there is another one who is not to be ruled. And so between them, in this eros field, and here again we're back to those myths of the Father God and the Mother God creating a space between them where there can be world. I think that makes sense, because it's only between a powerful integrated masculine image and a powerful integrated feminine image that you have enough regulation of their grandiosity. You see that? That is, if you're standing up here and you don't know about this person over here, you could really think that you rule it all. And she can think she rules it all. No need for cooperation there. But if the world appears through cooperation between two fully empowered beings that are entirely, in deep senses, different, other, Here's where the other comes in. Love, the capacity to love, this is the culmination of the development of the lover. Because it's the capacity to stand the thought that there is someone who is absolutely magnificent that is not me. See? Get that? See? Now think about this from the point of view of the lover. This is what the problem with love is. There is somebody that is absolutely magnificent that is not me and who is other and who I can never just swallow and include in me. You follow that? That I can never really comprehend. Get it? I may apprehend them some, but I will never comprehend them. That is, I will never master them. By definition, they will always remain other than me. Now, what happens to the lover in that case? There is an enormous longing for that being. You follow that? There is an enormous longing, and if you are not really integrated, you will have to shut that awareness off. This is what we call in psychoanalysis defending against our dependency needs. If there is something so wonderful that is free, and she can go at her own will, that requires enormous integration to be able to maintain awareness of her existence. Do you follow that? Or his existence. Now, this is what a challenge. Somebody said they were going to get married soon. This is a part of the challenge of any kind of relationship, because as long as we're not very integrated and balanced with a cohesive self, you have to deny the reality of the other. Can you follow that? Because if you are not really structurally, if your girders are not in place so that you can stand a lot of longing, then when you become aware of the beauty of the other, your girders will collapse. And you'll go into saying, I'm the only one there is. And that's what we call a narcissistic personality disorder. So there's a lot of stuff you can do following up your idea about locating this, and you can just see, in fact, I think that you see why there's so much of this sense of the difficulty of having anybody else in the world who's fully empowered and wonderful. It's easy, it's not really easy to attain a patriarchal wonderfulness. Can be achieved. It's not really easy to achieve a matriarchal wonderfulness. It's been achieved, probably. What would be hard, though, is to achieve both in full consciousness and realize you can't master the other. That would be hard. That's why history still is, the question is out whether that can be done among our species. See? So anyway, I leave you with that. Creation, powers of creation, tendency to split, tendency toward the evil of grandiosity overwhelming the whole thing, necessity to be limited by other energies, and finally to be limited by a equally worthy being who is fully magnificent, that is not you. And if you study mythology, we'll stop with that, you will notice that in most mythologies it's very difficult to hold the majesty of the feminine and the majesty of the masculine together without getting into some mischief of splitting. It tends to be a split. We're out of time. Thank you very much. I'll stick around a few minutes to answer questions, but thank you very much for your attention today. Thank you. Thank you.